As a kid growing up in the ghetto, one of the things I wanted the most was not money. It was fame. I wanted to be known. I wanted people to say, "Hey, there goes OJ." That wish came true for Mr. Orenthal James Simpson, one of the greatest American athletes that ever lived, and a man who was the accused in one of the grisliest and most controversial murder cases ever to paint TV screens all around the world. Was he guilty? Did he get away with murder? Was he an egomaniac harboring a dangerous personality disorder? Or was he the friendly, jovial giant he came across as in the public eye, the victim of a conspiracy? Not the type of guy who would almost hack off the head of the one he professed to love. Before we get into that, some of you might not be familiar with this once American idol, sports icon, and man that divided America. So let's introduce you to him. He's best known as O.J. Simpson, but to many back in the day, he was known as the Juice. Brought up on the wrong side of town to an adoring mother and a drag queen father, O.J. got into trouble as a kid and also suffered from physical disabilities due to having had rickets. But what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and this rather large boy started to focus his efforts on sports. This is a crime story, not a sports bio. So to cut a long story short, we can say that O.J. soon became an excellent American football player. So good, in fact, that he became one of the best college football players in history. His forte was running, dodging, crashing through, and gliding by players as if they were cardboard cutouts. He was destined for a very successful pro career. That got off to a rocky start, but then O.J. the Invincible became the first pro player to rush more than 2,000 yards in a season. The year was 1973, and O.J. was just 26. He was a sensation, and it can't be understated just how much he became a hero, not only to the African American community, but to all athletes and armchair aficionados of sports. Other players would breach 2,000 yards in the future, but only O.J. did it in a 14-game season. The others did it in 16 games. His stardom put his face on TV for more than just sports, with perhaps his liftoff to celebrity status being a Hertz car rental commercial featuring him running through an airport. The other cast of characters would smile and watch him run by, saying, "Go OJ!" He was the American dream come true, the black guy from the wrong side of the tracks, showing everyone that anyone could make it in America. Critics have since said he was used in a way to obfuscate the pervasive racism in America at the time, and his rags to riches tale was far from accessible to most poor black Americans. But others hailed his role model status as a veritable U.S. success story. O.J. soon became embedded in a predominantly white upper-class society. In interviews, some of his former friends have said this was problematic, that O.J. abandoned his roots, that he was merely a token black dude for people who cared little about him. O.J. said he never thought about color or race and just did what he did. He settled down and got married, and with his first wife had 3 children. One of those would die young from drowning. At the same time, O.J. was acting in Hollywood blockbusters. His dreams had come true. People really were saying, "Hey, there goes O.J." We must say at this point his celebrity didn't encircle the globe, as American football wasn't very popular outside of the US. But give him a few years and O.J. would be a household name from Adelaide to Aberdeen, for all the wrong reasons. In 1979, he met an 18-year-old girl called Nicole Brown, who was a waitress in a private Beverly Hills club called Daisy. He told one of his friends that one day he would marry this incredibly beautiful girl, and the unstoppable O.J. did just that after he had divorced his first wife. The year was 1985 when O.J. married Brown, and the two would have 2 children of their own shortly after the marriage. This was a rocky relationship, and in interviews, Brown's friends have come forward a number of times to say he was a man with a violent temper. In fact, in 1989, O.J. pleaded no contest to spousal abuse. The two later divorced in 1992. You can actually listen to a recording of Brown calling the police at one point, saying she was scared he was going to beat her badly. The domestic violence that O.J. perpetrated had not been denied, not even by most of his fans. But was the Juice capable of brutally murdering people? Let's now take you to the crime scene. The night of the crime was June 12, 1994. We might never know exactly what happened on that night, but Brown and her friend Ron Goldman were found dead at Brown's townhouse in Brentwood, Los Angeles. If you've seen the documentaries about this crime, you might have seen the crime scene photos. Brown had been hit on the head with a blunt object, slashed multiple times, and stabbed. It was likely she was already dead when the murderer slit her throat so viciously, he or she almost decapitated her. Goldman, it seems, had struggled with the murderer for some time, but having run into a place surrounded by bars, he had no way out. He was slashed and stabbed multiple times too. It seems one of his major arteries in his leg was cut and he lost a lot of blood quickly. But as one commentator said, the murderer again went into overkill. Goldman was stabbed in the neck at almost the same place multiple times. No one disagreed. Whoever had done this had done so fueled by a monstrous rage. It's said that Goldman had been at Brown's house as he was delivering some lost glasses. He had put those in an envelope. Both the glasses and the envelope were later found at the crime scene. We'll later hear in court that a loud bang was heard at her house in the evening. Simpson had never had a solid alibi, but has stated that he was home during the time of the murders, approximately 10:15 p.m. But we'll come back to that later. The first officers on the scene witnessed the carnage, noticing a bloody glove also just lying around. One detective, Mark Furman, then went around to OJ's house, fearing he might also be one of the victims, and if not, to tell OJ what happened at his former wife's house. OJ's house and Brown's place were only a matter of minutes away by car, and it's well known to police about OJ and Brown's marriage and divorce. At OJ's house, another bloody glove was found, and it matched the glove found at Brown's house. More blood was seen leading from Simpson's parked car. It was later discovered that the victim's blood was on both gloves, which gave police probable cause to arrest Simpson. The thing was, Simpson had flown to Chicago on the night of the murders. He'd also been taken to the airport by a Mr. Park in his limousine. It's thought that this happened sometime after the murders probably happened. Mr. Park would testify that when he was to pick Simpson up, his white Ford Bronco was not parked in the street. Simpson seemed to be out, and so he drove around waiting. Mr. Park would testify that it wasn't until 10:56 p.m. that he would see a large, strong-looking African-American man walk into Simpson's house. He went to the door and OJ finally appeared, saying he was sorry he was late. Off they went to the airport. So police are looking for Simpson, and they would get their chance to talk to him. After being told about the murder, Simpson flies back to LA. Police now have a search warrant for Simpson's house, and more blood is found. When OJ gets home, he's handcuffed and questioned for over 3 hours. The line of questioning has since been criticized. Cops go easy on him. A few days later, then he goes to the funeral of his ex-wife, and a day after that, he's charged with 2 counts of murder. He's asked to surrender, but he doesn't give himself up. Instead, what happens is one of the biggest media moments of the late 20th century, as Simpson is followed by helicopters and a stream of police cars down the highway. It's what's called a media circus. It has America and most of the world glued to their TV screens. It's reported that he has a gun and he might kill himself. People all over America believe this has been a setup. They shout, "Go OJ!" The cars following make it look more like a president's motorcade than a police chase. This will become one of the most iconic moments in news history. Massive crowds are waiting on highway bridges, standing in the streets, holding signs that read "Free OJ." They're chanting OJ, OJ, OJ. It's as if the juice is back on the field on one of his epic runs and the world doesn't want him to stop. His car finally arrives at his house. SWAT teams are out. People are running around. Helicopters overhead. It's chaos. OJ waits in his car. His gun is said to be close to his chin. If he steps out with the gun in his hand, he will most likely be shot. He doesn't want to do that and is talked out of the car. The negotiator years later will say that while in OJ's house, he noticed only pictures, paintings, photos of the star, none of anyone else, not even the family. And so to lure him out of the car, he appealed to OJ's ego, his greatness. It worked. People interviewed in the streets are saying it's a conspiracy, more oppression and human rights abuses by a police force known to be corrupt, sometimes racist, sometimes unnecessarily violent. The case of Rodney King still stings among the African American community, who for good reason have doubts about the ethics of the LAPD. The police are well aware of the tension and the destruction of the LA riots of '92. They move as if tenterhooks. Other men may have perhaps been treated with less trepidation. A court date is made. The prosecutors later said to the media, "I don't think I'd ever seen so much evidence in one case." It didn't look cut and dried, but to OJ's fans, something was rotten in the state of California. If anyone could find where that stink was coming from, it was the civil rights lawyer John Cochran. He was a hero to many people in the African American community. Already, some people had forgotten about the 2 hacked bodies and were concentrating their emotions on a race case. Cochran had done commendable work over the years and had fought for the downtrodden, and OJ had the money to hire him, as well as a bevy of other top lawyers. "Boy, I was set up," OJ would soon say, and his words echoed throughout black communities over the USA. Surveys showed that only 10% of African Americans in the US thought he was guilty. The final jury, many of them black Americans, were also later said to have been somewhat blinded or moved by the race issue. OJ even said to his lawyer, joking, If this jury says I did it, maybe I did do it. It wasn't cheap though, the trial. It said OJ would make around $3 million just by signing items with autographs as he sat in jail. He was still adored by many regardless of what he might have done. It was the trial of the century, and within a trial was another kind of trial. That's because the policeman that found the glove at OJ's house would be found to have said some very racist things in the past. On top of that, it was also found with good evidence that he had bragged about police brutality. The case became as much about this bad cop as it did the murders. Yet again, another giant FAIL for the LAPD. The glove must have been planted by him, shouted OJ fans. It's just another case of police racism. There was blood of the victims all over the place, from OJ's house to his car. It was open and shut in terms of DNA evidence. But those crafty lawyers proved that the crime scene had been contaminated and that possibly there had been a setup. They weren't trying to prove that the cops had something against OJ, only that the possibility that they had planted evidence for an easier arrest. Even though OJ had been cut himself that night and his blood was mixed with the victims, the lawyers managed to convince a jury that something was wrong. And indeed, the police had mishandled evidence. We might also say that DNA evidence was kind of new to everyone, not just the jury. Nowadays, we can read things such as this. It is reported that the DNA evidence showed that the chance that some of the blood found near the bodies came from anyone but Simpson was 1 in 170 million. The chance that the blood found on Simpson's sock could be from someone other than Nicole Brown was 1 in 21 billion. But back then, the jurors didn't trust DNA. They also believed the defense in that there had been some kind of setup and OJ's blood had been taken and just thrown everywhere. From the crime scene to his car, to his house, to his clothes. The gloves were tried on in court, and famously, OJ donned latex gloves first, and then somewhat dramatically proved his hands were too big for the leather ones. Another bad move from the prosecution. His blood and the victims were on those gloves, but it didn't matter. As Cochran told the jury, if the glove doesn't fit, acquit. Hair from an African American was also found at the scene and on Ron Goldman's shirt, while shoes matching Simpson's size had made footprints in the blood. After the trial, evidence would be found of Simpson owning the exact shoes that were worn by the killer, but it was too late then. The sock we just mentioned was also found at Simpson's home, and that too had blood of the victims on it. But as we said, some finagling by very clever lawyers persuaded the jury not that the cops had colluded and set OJ up, but that there was a chance that evidence had been mishandled. Photos of Brown's bruised face were shown to the jury. From a time Simpson had beat her in the past and been arrested, it didn't matter. There was a racist cop involved with that evidence, and that meant something. LAPD criminalists had done a poor job, and that meant something too. Cochran orated a summation fitting of a wartime speech, and even though it was completely over the top by many people's standards, it meant something as well. So even with so much evidence, the case of the prosecution was doomed. And as one of the former jurors said in a documentary interview, she was never going to find him guilty. This was payback for Rodney King. She said 90% of the other juries thought the same. Although in the same documentary, another former juror said she had no bones about King relating to this case. But the prosecution had pretty much failed and let a guilty man go free. Lots of evidence was not presented by the defense, such as Brown calling a woman's shelter days before her death, saying she feared her ex-husband was stalking her, or the fact that a shop owner had said Simpson had bought a 15-inch knife from him that might have matched the kind of knife in the murders. The prosecution couldn't use that because the man who sold it to Simpson sold his story to the media. Police did search for a knife but couldn't find one. The media also reports that a knife was found during the demolition of Simpson's house some years later, but it was kept as a memento by an LAPD officer. Another person said she saw Simpson's Ford Bronco driving wildly that night, but she also sold that story to the media, and so the prosecution couldn't use her testimony. Civil rights activists called it a victory for Black America, and no shortage of people jubilantly shouted from the streets that justice had been served. What most people fail to realize is that OJ had admitted that he would have lost without doubt had he not have had this expensive team of lawyers. In terms of human rights, was this justice not justice bought with money? Did the color of the money hold more sway than the color of the skin? No one seemed to ask. Black, white, or brown, if you're poor, you're having a harder time in court than if you're rich. Had justice really prevailed? It was hard to call it a victory. and in this case might have meant two people being slaughtered like cattle by a man who thought he was untouchable. Simpson did lose a civil case to Ron Goldman's family, and a jury found O.J. guilty of causing wrongful death. This meant that Simpson was ordered in total to pay both families of the deceased $33.5 million in compensatory and punitive damages. But how much they got was nothing close to that. They hounded Simpson for years, or at least the Goldmans did, but O.J. had a way of protecting what little money he had left. O.J. did end up going to prison after a few years of acting like a gangster and making music videos and some TV shows. He was apparently trying to get some of his memorabilia back, but a failed hotel heist in Las Vegas got him 9 years. He was released in 2017, and it said he now lives a quiet life as a retiree somewhere in Las Vegas. Apparently, he still loves golf, but we might imagine his juice glass these days is half empty. His former manager is now reportedly making a new documentary. He has stated that Simpson did the murders but did not act alone. There's also a very strange television interview that's come to light, in which Simpson gives a hypothetical version of events on the night of the murders. What's strange is that Simpson basically retraces the steps of himself that night and how he hypothetically commits the murders. He says this in the third person, such as he took the Bronco to her home with his friend, brought a knife, and put on a hat and gloves for dramatic effect. He even added, "It was horrible, it was absolutely horrible." Simpson then says Goldman tried some karate move with him and he asked him if he thought he could kick his backside. He said he then blacked out, but came around and there was stuff all around them. He was talking about blood. If you watch this, you might just wonder what the heck you've just seen. The video was not published for many years because it was such a sensitive case and there could be legal issues, so the tapes were reportedly only recently found. Today we're going to give you another dark tale dredged from the quagmire of human depravity. We'll start with what should have been a harmless fishing trip. It involved two friends, well, one friend and one killer. What the innocent of the party doesn't know is that the other man is living under his identity. That poses a problem for the killer to be, so he needs to get him out of the way. What he did is said, "Hey, let's go fishing." The innocent man agreed, and he ended up swimming with the fishes in the English Channel. The man that killed him has one of the strangest stories ever told. That man is named Albert Johnson Walker, and his story begins in Ontario, Canada. We don't know much about his upbringing there, but we do know he was a high school dropout. We also know he liked money early on in life, and his first job was working for a trust company. There, he learned the tricks of the trade and also started doing bookkeeping as a freelance gig in his spare time. So far, nothing untoward is happening, but when he opened his firm Walker Financial Services Incorporated, he was likely always leaning to criminality. That firm for a while did well, and Walker opened 6 branches in total and employed around 30 people. But then in 1986, a stock that he had invested heavily in went bust, and that meant a lot of his people lost the money they'd given him to invest. It said he defrauded around 70 of his Canadian clients to the sum of $3.2 million. He was good at getting people's money, and part of his trickery was gaining folks' trust. Who wouldn't believe him? He was a pillar of the community, a successful businessman, and also a Sunday school teacher. This was all for show, however. He was gifted to some extent, but he was also a natural-born scammer. He knew he had to get out of Canada, but he also had a wife and 4 kids. He said something like this to the loving wife, "Hey, I think I'll take our 15-year-old daughter on a skiing trip to Europe. Hope you don't mind. You stay here and take care of our 3 other kids." He had no intention of ever coming back to his family. In fact, he'd been planning a getaway for some time, having set up a dodgy company in the Cayman Islands, where all of his church-going friends' cash was hiding. Just before he left, he metaphorically kicked his wife in the face as behind her back, he had remortgaged their house to the tune of $44,000. This was his spending money. All this didn't escape the eyes of the Canadian police, but it seemed that they were always one step behind this crook. When Walker took off to Europe with his daughter, he soon became Canada's most wanted criminal, and he was also high on the list of Interpol's most wanted. What do you do when the world is looking for you? You change your name, of course. Albert Walker went to the UK, and he became a Mr. David Wallace Davis. This new man ended up in London, and there he showed everyone that he was a wealthy entrepreneur. He was quite the socialite and good at making friends, just as he was in Canada when he impressed all his devout buddies. It was all an act, of course, but the Brits loved him. One of the people he met was named Elaine Boyce, and she was the receptionist for a fine art auctioneer in a place called Harrogate in North Yorkshire. This is a charming part of the industrial north, what some Brits might call a posh place, just outside the fairly large city of Leeds. It was an ideal place for Walker, now Davis, to start a new life of scamming. The woman he talked to who lived there told him that she had a boyfriend and he was fanatical about Canada. This guy, named Ronald Platt, even had a maple leaf tattooed on his hand. She told Davis that she and her BF wanted nothing more than to move to Canada. Thought Walker, maybe I can help you out. Both Walker and Platt got into business together in Harrogate, which was just an extension of Platt's TV repair business. The two became partners, and we guess Walker invested some of that stolen cash into the business. Platt, though, was always restless and he really wanted to move to Canada. While all this was going on, you might ask what the 15-year-old kid was thinking. Well, she had aged a few years, and believe it or not, Walker was pretending that she was his wife. She even had 2 children, but she never revealed if the kids were her father's. We warned you that this was a dark tale. It gets much darker. So Platt wants to go to Canada, and Walker is a maniac. The maniac tells the innocent man that he'll pay for his move to Canada. Wow, thinks Platt. What a great man. Walker said there's just one thing. If Platt's to skedaddle to the land of poutine in extreme winters, he'll have to sign a few things over first regarding the business. Walker also told Platt that to keep the business going, he'll need Platt's driver's license, signature stamp, and birth certificate. Yeah, that sounds awfully sketchy, but Walker was extremely gifted in the art of scammery. Platt took off to Canada in the early 90s, but it wasn't a land of milk and honey for him, and he soon fell into financial difficulties. Meanwhile, Walker was now living in the UK as a Mr. Platt. From Walker to Davis to Platt, he had forged documents, and this worked well for him. Now we have the problem we talked about in the intro. Platt came back to the UK broke and wanted to start his life there again. Only Harrogate wasn't big enough for 2 Ronald Platts. One of them had to go. At this time, the real Platt thinks Davis is still Davis, and so when he's invited to go on a fishing trip on a boat, he agrees. It's the summer of '96 and a good time to go fishing. The two went out on their boat called the Lady Jane and floated around the English Channel. All we know is that during the trip at some point, Walker went up behind Platt and knocked him unconscious. He was out, but still in the boat. Walker then attached a 4.5 kilogram anchor to Platt's belt and threw the body overboard. Good riddance, thought fake Platt. Now I get to go back to being you again. And it could have been the perfect crime, but in the words of Scooby-Doo, he would have gotten away with it if it weren't for one thing. We have cops in Canada looking for Walker, and on the boat we now have one man pretending to be Platt, who no doubt is proud of his crime. The problem is the real Platt was wearing a watch when he was thrown overboard. That might not seem like much to you, but you obviously haven't watched enough Scooby-Doo. You see, 2 weeks after he was chucked into the sea, a fisherman found the body. At the time, it was unrecognizable and police had no idea who they had found. What they did find, though, still in good condition, was a watch on the body's hand. That watch was a Rolex, and we're not talking about one of those fakes you can buy in Cambodian night markets. The cops thought at first that they had a suicide on their hands, but they had to find the identity of the body that was half eaten by fish. To do that, they looked at the watch. If you have a very expensive watch, you usually get it serviced. And so the cops looked for the service markings on the thing and they found some. And they went off to the store where it had been serviced. Lo and behold, the cops found out that this watch had belonged to a man named Ronald Platt, which was weird because Ronald Platt was alive and well and had a TV repair business. What was going on? Because this body was certainly Platt. They also knew when that person had died because while the Rolex was waterproof, if inactive, they were told that it would stop working after 44 hours. They just had to look at the calendar to see when it stopped. Now they went on to meet this other Platt guy. They waited 3 weeks before pouncing, and then on Halloween, armed cops raided his house. After he was arrested, the cops discovered the man had been Walker, then Davis, and then Platt. They also looked at the boat Walker owned. Police would later say inside the cabin were some cushions on which we found some head hairs. DNA tests proved that they were from the deceased man. And forensic tests found zinc traces from the anchor on Mr. Platt's belt and traces of the leather on the anchor. They found out that he was a wanted man in Canada and he was also charged with murder. They discovered a woman at the house, someone who the neighbors thought was Mrs. Platt. It was, of course, the daughter named Sheena. In 1998, he was found guilty of murdering his friend and business partner, and the court heard about this man's double life. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge saying, "It was in my judgment a callous, premeditated killing designed to eliminate a man you had used for your own selfish ends. He also said, the killing was carefully planned and cunningly executed with chilling efficiency. The con man had gold bars hidden and stacks of cash. He was set up if he had remained Mr. Platt. And for his daughter, she came out a few years later and told the Canadian media that her father was an evil man. She said she wanted him to die in an English prison, and she said she was very disappointed to hear that the authorities had agreed to send Walker back to Canada to finish his sentence. She said, I fear for my family's safety. I believe that he poses a threat and I need to protect my family from him. That's because Platt might get released early due to his ill health, but as we write this, it seems he's still doing time. She also said, I was under the impression that he'd be gone for a lot longer and I'd have to build a better life for my family, just in order to protect them from the future and any threat he poses to us. As for her 2 kids, well, she's never said who the father is. The daughter said that her pop had not told her about the cash he'd ripped off of those Canadians, and when he took her to the UK, he just manipulated her and filled her head with lies. Walker, by the way, has always maintained his innocence, saying Platt was his good friend. He admitted that throughout his life, he might have at times been economical with the truth, which could be the understatement of the century. The daughter just wants to forget about her past life, telling the media, I don't want any contact with him. I want to move on with the rest of my life and have some closure on this. Albert Walker was caught thanks to a big shiny clue, as well as modern forensics. But what could the police do in the times before modern science opened up the possibility of using DNA to identify suspects, or find latent fingerprints at a crime scene? What hope would a police detective in the late 1800s have to catch one of the most notorious serial killers of all time, who stalked the streets of London committing grisly crimes without leaving behind a shred of evidence or a clue to his identity? Wednesday, September 29, 1982. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up not feeling well. She had a runny nose and a sore throat. Her parents allowed her to stay home from school. They suggested that she take Tylenol to go back to bed. A while later, Mary went to the bathroom and collapsed. From another room, Mary's dad heard a loud thump as if something heavy had fallen. He knocked on the bathroom door asking if Mary needed help, but she didn't answer. He forced the door open and found Mary sprawled unconscious on the floor. Worried, her parents called an ambulance. The EMTs were unable to revive her. Neither were the doctors in the ER when she arrived at Alexian Brothers Medical Center in Elk Grove Village, a suburb of Chicago. By 9:30 a.m., Mary had been pronounced dead. The doctors thought it was a stroke, but we're going to run some tests since this was an unusual death for a healthy preteen girl. In Arlington Heights, Illinois, 27-year-old postal worker Adam Janus was feeling awful, so he decided to take the day off work. He took some Tylenol and laid down for a nap. Later, his wife came to check on him and found him unresponsive. Adam was dead by the time the ambulance delivered him to the ER at Northwest Community Hospital. Initially, Adam was thought to have had a massive heart attack, but the diagnosis didn't sit well with Dr. Kim as Adam was young, healthy, and had no history of heart trouble. Dr. Kim talked to several members of the Janus family who had rushed to the hospital. That evening, Adam's devastated family gathered at his home to make arrangements. Adam's younger brother, 25-year-old Stanley, and his wife, 19-year-old Teresa, had headaches from the events of the day. Both took Tylenol. On his way outside to have a cigarette, Stanley collapsed. They called for an ambulance. While the paramedics were loading her husband on a stretcher, Teresa fell unconscious too. Suspecting the family had been exposed to poison, possibly carbon monoxide, the rest of the Janus family was taken to the hospital for observation. They were given their last rites just in case. At the hospital, Dr. Kim was shocked to learn that 2 members of the Janus family that had been perfectly fine hours before were now in comas. Sadly, Stanley would die later on that night, and 2 days later, Teresa would be removed from life support. Meanwhile, a team consisting of police, a nurse from the public health office, and an inspector visited Adam's house to find the contaminant. They didn't find anything unusual, but Nurse Jensen, realizing that all 3 members of the family had taken the same medication, collected the Tylenol bottle. Back at the hospital, Dr. Kim was trying to find a link between the illness of all 3 family members. While Nurse Jensen suggested Tylenol, several officials were skeptical. Meanwhile, 2 firefighters, Richard Keyworth and Philip Capitelli, chatted about the strange calls their department received that day. They realized the similarities between Mary Kellerman's death and the Janus deaths. Richard said to his friend, "This is a wild stab, but maybe it's the Tylenol." They ended up contacting Dr. Kim, and the police tracked down the Kellerman's bottle of Tylenol. Both Tylenol bottles had the same control number, MC2880. Upon first inspection, they seemed normal, but when the capsules were opened, the distinctive cyanide scent of bitter almonds filled the air. Cyanide is a poison that kills rapidly by inhibiting the body's ability to use oxygen. Upon testing, each of the Tylenol capsules proved to be laced with enough potassium cyanide to kill thousands. Sadly, within 2 days, 3 more victims passed away. 27-year-old Mary Reiner, who had recently given birth to her 4th child and was experiencing aches and pains. A 30-year-old Mary McFarland, who had a headache coming on during a busy shift at the Illinois Bell Phone Center. After taking Tylenol in the break room, Mary staggered out into the office and collapsed to the horror of her coworkers. The final victim was Paula Prince, a 35-year-old Chicago flight attendant. Exhausted after arriving late from a Las Vegas run, she bought Tylenol around 9 p.m. at a Walgreens near her apartment. Paula went home, got ready for bed, took some capsules, and collapsed. Her body was discovered 2 days later when her sister came to check on her after not being able to reach her by phone. On September 30th, the day after Mary Kellerman's death, Dr. Kim confirmed cyanide in the toxicology results and immediately notified the federal government. Johnson & Johnson was also alerted. The Public Health Department held a press conference warning residents of Greater Chicago that Tylenol bottles had been tampered with and cyanide had been found. At this point in time, closed items at stores just came with a top and maybe cotton packing if it was medicine. There were no elaborate seals to prevent anyone from tampering with the product. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, Johnson & Johnson had issued a recall for all Tylenol from lot MC2880. When news of the poisonings broke, there was a panic across Greater Chicago. Deaths and warnings about Tylenol dominated the press. Police drove up and down the streets, issued warnings against Tylenol through loudspeakers. They handed out flyers in several different languages. The medication was pulled from store shelves. People turned up at local hospitals convinced they were suffering from cyanide poisoning when it was an unrelated illness. Over the next few days, Johnson & Johnson halts production of Tylenol capsules. The FDA tests over 1 million capsules and finds no poisonings outside of Chicago. After Mary Reiner and Paula's deaths, the authorities realized their Tylenol had different control numbers. Mayor Jane Bryan banned sales of Tylenol in Chicago. The FDA issues warnings to consumers nationwide not to take any Tylenol in capsules. Several states begin to take action on their own banned sales of Tylenol. Then on October 5th, about a week after the first death, Johnson & Johnson recalls all Tylenol products nationwide. This is around 31 million bottles valued at more than $100 million. Consumers are urged to return the medication for a full refund. The company establishes a 1-800 phone number to directly handle calls from a panicked public, and a media line for communication with reporters. They offer $100,000 as a reward to anyone who can identify a suspect. Meanwhile, a task force drawn from 15 federal, state, and local agencies consisting of 140 people to track down the killer has been convened. They traced the path of Tylenol sold in Chicago through manufacturing, distribution, and retail, talking to hundreds of workers along the way. Authorities even questioned store cashiers about any strange persons who might have lingered in the stores or bought multiple boxes of Tylenol. The victims' bottles contain both safe and poisoned capsules, which suggest tampering with the individual bottle. This and checks at manufacturing plants quickly rule out possibilities of manufacturing defects in the Tylenol. The most prominent theory was of a lone wolf murderer. The killer visited each store and paid for the Tylenol, not wanting to risk a shoplifting arrest. They then emptied a handful of capsules, replaced the acetaminophen with potassium cyanide, reassembled the capsules, sprinkled a few on top of each bottle to ensure quick ingestion, and returned the box to the shelf sometime around September 28th. In 1982, store surveillance cameras and scanner databases were just beginning to come into widespread use, so it would be entirely possible for an individual to slip boxes back onto the shelves and not be detected. When their search with retailers didn't turn up anything unusual, investigators widened their probe. They checked for a possible manipulation of Johnson & Johnson's stock prices by an imagined white-collar crime syndicate. They examined the Puerto Rican terrorist group FALN. The victims' families were intensely interviewed. Previous arrested shoplifters in Chicago got a second look, and on and on. On October 6, Johnson & Johnson received an extortion letter demanding $1 million to stop the killings. The unsigned letter provided a bank account to deposit the money to. Upon investigation, the authorities determined that the bank account belonged to Frederick Miller McKay, and the letter had been stamped by the postage meter machine on Frederick's now-defunct travel agency. Chicago authorities grilled Frederick and were able to rule him out. Then they asked if he had any enemies who would make trouble for him. Frederick came up with the names Robert and Nancy Richardson. When his business Lakeside Travel went belly up, the final wage checks bounced. Several employees had sued Frederick for wages, but the judge dismissed their claim. Robert Richardson, the husband of his former employee Nancy, had been especially bitter over how things played out. A subsequent investigation identified Richard and Nancy as James and Leanne Lewis. The couple had previously been involved in several questionable check writing and tax fraud scams, but always managed to skip town and stay ahead of the law. Also, James had been charged with the 1978 Kansas City murder of one of his former clients. However, the charges were dropped after a judge ruled that the police search of Lewis's home was illegal. Unfortunately, the Lewis's current whereabouts were unknown. A national manhunt ensued and James's face was plastered all over the news. He wrote several letters to various newspapers proclaiming his innocence, but they were finally caught in New York. Shortly after he was taken into custody, Leanne surrendered. James was questioned intensively, but the authorities were never able to link him to the Tylenol tamperings. It seemed he had written the extortion letter as revenge in the hopes that Frederick Miller McCahey would be investigated. James Lewis was convicted of attempting to extort $1 million from Johnson & Johnson after the fact and sentenced to 20 years. Another prominent suspect was a 48-year-old dockhand named Roger Arnold. At the Lincoln Park Taverns one evening, Roger explained how he would go about committing the Tylenol murders. Another patron reported him. Officers arrested him on a 4-month-old assault complaint and used the opportunity to interrogate him about the poisonings. As it turns out, a series of coincidences further implicated Roger. He worked at a Jewel supermarket warehouse with the father of the victim, Mary Reiner. A search of his home revealed several unlicensed guns, how-to crime manuals, a bag of chemical powder, and beakers and funnels, but the powder turned out to be potassium carbonate, not cyanide. Other than saying it was for nothing illegal, Roger refused to explain why he had the powder. Roger was charged with assault and weapons violations, released on $6,000 bond. Resentful of the situation, he came to believe tavern owner Marty Sinclair was the one who ratted him out. On June 18, 1983, Roger shot 46-year-old computer consultant John Stanisha, but it was a case of mistaken identity for Marty. He was convicted in 1984 for second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years. Despite all the interviews and tips from the public, the investigation went nowhere. Only 100 days into the investigation, the 140-person team was whittled down to 20 detectives. Over the next year, the team would slowly grow smaller until the unit was disbanded. Investigators collected 15,000 pages of documents and interviewed 400 persons of interest out of a pool of 20,000. Today, more than 35 years later, the case remains unsolved. Ultimately, Johnson & Johnson ended up testing 1.5 million bottles of Tylenol and finding 3 unopened bottles contaminated with cyanide, for a total of 10 bottles that had been tampered. The company took a major hit. In 1981, Tylenol was the #1 non-prescription painkiller in the U.S. and accounted for 17% of the Johnson & Johnson net income. After the recall, Johnson & Johnson's share of the $1.2 billion painkiller industry plunged from 37% to 7%. Many in the financial industry thought that Johnson & Johnson would never recover. 2 months later, Johnson & Johnson relaunched Tylenol in tamper-proof packaging amid an extensive media campaign. The company also introduced price reductions and a new version of their pills, the Caplet, a tablet coated with a slick, easy-to-swallow gelatin that would be hard to tamper with. Within a few years, the company had completely bounced back and gained a good reputation as the company had chosen customer welfare over business. Johnson & Johnson's tamper-proof packaging soon became an industry standard. The same year, the FDA issued its first regulations for tamper-resistant packaging of over-the-counter drugs. Also in 1983, Congress passed a bill that made it a federal crime to tamper with medication and other consumer goods. Previously, it had only been a misdemeanor. Families of the victims sued Johnson & Johnson, asserting that the pharmaceutical company should have been prepared for product tampering. In 1991, the families of all 7 victims agreed to a settlement for an undisclosed sum. One of the provisions of the settlement was that the annuities be created to pay the college costs of the victims' 8 children. James Lewis was paroled in October 1995 after serving a bit more than half of his 20-year sentence. Over the years, he's had several provocative interviews with authorities, explaining that during his years in prison, he had a lot of time to think about the crime and had some insights into how it might have been committed. In 2009, the FBI reopened the Tylenol case. They searched James Lewis's home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and seized several items, including an old Macintosh computer. In 2010, James was ordered to provide fingerprint and DNA samples to authorities. In 2011, federal investigators requested a DNA sample from the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, who lived in the Chicagoland area at the time of the murders. Some critics think investigating James Lewis and Ted Kaczynski are just distractions to keep the public focused on the lone wolf theory and protect Johnson & Johnson from liability. As long as the FBI has the case open, access to evidence and documents is limited. Some people have come to believe that the tampering occurred in the distribution channel of the Tylenol manufacturer. At the time, little was reported on the strange incident that occurred the day before the first murder. Around 2:30 a.m. on September 28, 1982, 2 Kane County Sheriff deputies Al Swanson and Joseph Chavez stopped at a Howard & Johnson's Hotel and Diner in a suburb of Greater Chicago to grab a bite to eat. On a grassy strip near the parking lot, they noticed 2 boxes marked with the words "Extra Strength Tylenol Capsules." Hundreds of capsules were scattered on the ground, as well as a pile of white powder. The deputies scraped up some of the powder and rubbed it between their fingers. They assumed a drug dealer cutting illegal drugs had dumped the suspicious items. Not aware of any particular crime, they simply left the boxes. Not long after eating, both men became sick. Al had extreme nausea, dizziness, and vomiting, and Joseph noticed pain and swelling in his arm. They rushed away without making a connection with the symptoms in the packages. Al couldn't finish his shift. Joseph finished his shift with the arm pain continuing. The next morning, both were hospitalized. It wasn't until a few days later they realized the implications. Authorities returned to the parking lot, but by that time most of the evidence was gone. Michelle Rosen, daughter of victim Mary Lynn Reiner, also believes the killer was someone involved with Johnson & Johnson. In 2015, she created a Kickstarter campaign to raise money for a film to be made that would request the FBI close the case and unseal the documents. A short documentary pointed out some of the inconsistencies in the investigation. Unfortunately, the campaign didn't raise the necessary funds. There are many who think the case can never truly be solved. The FBI turned over all the recalled bottles for testing to the liable corporation Johnson & Johnson. The company tested less than 1% of the bottles and destroyed the rest. Testing all of the bottles might have revealed that a significant amount of them contained cyanide-filled capsules and could have proven that the tampering took place before the bottles reached stores.
Nothing is more terrifying than a horrific unsolved murder and the possibility that the perpetrator is still at large, free, and waiting to strike again. While conviction rates have improved dramatically in the last few decades, thanks to improvements in police forensic techniques and tools, there remain an unsettling number of truly chilling unsolved cases that haunt the communities affected as neighbor watches neighbor, knowing there's a possibility a killer lives amongst them. Welcome to this episode of the Infographics Show, Top 10 Most Heinous Unsolved Murders. At number 10 is the women of Ciudad Juarez. Ciudad Juarez, or Juarez City, is a Mexican border town known for its extreme drug trafficking-related violence, with the US State Department warning Americans to steer clear at all costs. Yet for the last 3 decades, someone has been killing the women of Juarez, and seems to have absolutely no connection to cartel violence. Specifically targeting young, slim brunettes with big eyes, anywhere from 260 to over 400 women have been raped, tortured, and killed since 1993, their bodies further mutilated after death and discarded in ditches, fields, or even on roadways in plain public sight. Despite the obvious danger, young women continue to come to Ciudad Juarez, lured by employment opportunities in a growing industrial sector that aren't available at home. In November 2017, 2 bus drivers were arrested and confessed to the rape, torture, and murder of 8 new victims, but later it was suspected that their confessions were coerced under torture by a frustrated police force. Whether the bus drivers were guilty or not, their arrest did not stop the killing, with 2 more victims discovered while the men awaited trial in jail. Mexican authorities remain convinced that the killings are not related to cartel violence, but are completely stumped as to the perpetrators. Meanwhile, the head of the FBI office across the border in El Paso warns that there is a real possibility the killings are the responsibility of an American serial killer drawn to the area due to the known ineffectiveness of local Mexican police. At number 9 is a Hollywood legend and cautionary tale to young starlets everywhere, the murder of the Black Dahlia. On the morning of January 15, 1947, a mother walking with her child in a Los Angeles neighborhood stumbled upon what she thought was at first a discarded mannequin, but upon closer inspection, realized to her horror that it was the nude and dismembered body of young 22-year-old Hollywood hopeful Elizabeth Short. The young actress had apparently been tied up and tortured for days before finally being killed. The killer then cut her body neatly in half along the waist and drained it all of blood, carefully laying it down on an abandoned lot and posing it with arms raised over the shoulders and legs splayed in a lurid, seductive pose. Her mouth had also been sliced open from ear to ear to extend her smile. Due to the precise and nearly surgical nature of the way the body had been cut and exsanguinated, police immediately conducted interviews with medical students at the University of Southern California Medical School, but found no suspect. Weeks later, the police received an anonymous letter possibly sent by the killers, but were unable to match the fingerprints with anything in the FBI's files. At number 8 is the haunting murder of John Benet Ramsey. On December 26, 1996, John Ramsey found his 6-year-old daughter dead in the basement of his Boulder, Colorado home. Just 8 hours prior, his wife had found a ransom note demanding $118,000 in cash for their daughter's safe return, though the kidnappers never contacted the couple again. With no kidnappers trying to collect a ransom, the entire family was under suspicion for murder of the 6-year-old beauty pageant queen, with John Ramsey's 2 adult children from a previous marriage the first to be cleared of suspicion. The police then shifted their focus to her 9-year-old brother Burke, and then to John Ramsey and his wife Patsy. 3 years later, at age 12, Burke was questioned by a grand jury but not charged, and in 2006, John Mark Carr was arrested on suspicion of murdering John Benet, only to have the case dropped when DNA proved he could not have been at the crime scene. John and his now dead wife Patsy were finally cleared of suspicion after new DNA evidence was discovered, pointing to a mysterious and unknown third party. Though John Ramsey maintains hope that the killer will be brought to justice, there seems to be little chance that that will actually ever happen. At number 7 is a baffling case from Vancouver, British Columbia. Since August 2007, a total of 14 human feet have washed ashore, still stuffed into the sneakers the individuals were wearing at the time of death. While DNA tests match some of the feet to missing people with mental health issues, the other feet have yet to be identified, and no killer or motive is apparent. While some have proposed natural explanations, such as the feet belonging to drowning victims, it's mysterious that the feet only began to appear in 2007 and have not stopped yet. Number 6 is a classic American crime story, the double murder of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman. On June 12, 1994, American football player O.J. Simpson alleged that he came home to discover his wife and her lover dead. While most Americans remain extremely suspicious of Simpson's guilt, and with large amounts of circumstantial evidence all piled up against him, Simpson was eventually found not guilty of the murder, though a civil suit filed by Nicole Simpson's family would find him guilty, and Simpson would go on to release a book entitled If I Did It. Despite these developments, the criminal matter remains technically unsolved. One of the most famous authors in American history, Edgar Allan Poe's death, is our number 5 unsolved mystery. Leaving New York City late in 1849 and bound for Richmond, Virginia, Poe would only make it as far as Baltimore, where a passerby noticed Poe delirious and incoherent outside of a bar on October 3rd. Taken to a nearby hospital, Poe would be dead within 4 days, with the official cause listed as congestion of the brain, a euphemism of that age for alcohol poisoning. Accepted at the time as a valid explanation, scholars in later years would discover that the rumors of his drug and alcohol abuse were greatly exaggerated by vindictive literary critics hoping to discredit the talented author. While some historians believe he may have suffered from rabies, cholera, or even syphilis, others believe that Poe may have fallen victim to a practice known as cooping, wherein corrupt politicians paid thugs to kidnap homeless men, drug them, disguise them, and then drag them to polls all over the city or state, possibly explaining why Poe was headed for Richmond, but only made it as far as Baltimore and wearing clothes that weren't his. At number 4 is a truly terrifying crime, the Tylenol murders of 1982. When buying medicine, the last thing you expect is for it to make you feel worse, let alone kill you. Yet that's exactly what happened to 7 individuals who ingested potassium cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules. No killer was ever discovered, and in later years, more people would die from copycat crimes, ultimately leading to major industry reforms in package anti-tampering devices and laws both. While no one was officially charged with the murders, New York City resident James William Lewis was considered a prime suspect and convicted of extortion after sending a letter to Tylenol manufacturer Johnson & Johnson, taking credit for the deaths and demanding $1 million to stop them. At number 3 is the murder of American hip-hop legend Tupac Shakur. On November 30th, 1994, Tupac was shot a total of 5 times, 3 times in the chest and twice in the head, but survived. The rapper immediately pointed a finger at several New York rappers, including Sean Combs and the Notorious B.I.G., as responsible for the murder attempt. This would lead to the further escalating of an already explosive East Coast-West Coast rivalry that spread violence throughout the hip-hop community. On September 7, 1996, as Tupac Shakur left a boxing match at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, a white Cadillac pulled up alongside his vehicle and shot the rapper multiple times. Rushed to a hospital, Shakur would die 6 days later of internal bleeding. The Notorious B.I.G. and Sean Combs were immediately suspected of having orchestrated the murder, but suspicion also spread to Tupac's own manager and notorious hip-hop producer Suge Knight. In the end, the case remains unsolved, with some fans believing the rapper faked his own death and still produces music somewhere in secret. I like killing people because it is so much fun. So begins one of several encrypted letters to San Francisco newspapers by a man calling himself the Zodiac. At the number 2 spot, the Zodiac Killer story is by now the stuff of American crime legend, and several films have been produced following the 1969 murder spree that terrorized Bay Area residents. Starting on December 20th, 1968, with the murder of a couple shot to death in their car as they parked on Lover's Lane, the killer would strike again over the next 10 months, killing a total of 5, though there are strong possibilities he killed even more. What made the Zodiac's murder spree so fascinating, though, were the enigmatic and coded letters he sent to newspapers, teasing at his motives and identity. Though the investigation would go on for years and several suspects were considered, the Zodiac was never caught and remains at large. And finally, at number 1 is the single most haunting unsolved crime in all of history, the murder spree of Jack the Ripper. Between August 7th and November 10th, 1888, a total of 5 prostitutes were killed in the Whitechapel district of London's East End. The victims all had their throats slashed and bodies mutilated, some with body parts or internal organs missing, including one victim whose kidney was mailed to the police, along with a series of notes taunting investigators and signed by someone calling themselves the Ripper. Though 3 suspects were identified early in the investigation, the search for the Ripper's real identity ultimately proved fruitless, and nobody was ever charged with the murders. Terrified Londoners became so outraged at the police's failure to apprehend the killer that both the Home Secretary and London Police Commissioner would end up resigning in disgrace. When we're kids, we believe in monsters, until we grow up enough to learn that monsters don't really exist, nor are they lurking under your bed waiting to eat you. Yet as these top 10 unsolved murders all show, monsters may be more real than we would like to believe, and a great deal of them all remain at large, waiting for their next victim.
September 23rd, 1983. It's the end of the evening shift for the staff at the Kentucky Fried Chicken outlet in Kilgore, Texas. As the last customers leave, there's a lot of laughing and joking. It's Friday night, time to have some fun. The main door then swings open. A warm breeze hits the startled staff. "We're closed," says the assistant manager. None of them return home that night. The next time anyone sees them, they're lying dead on the ground, executed. Let's now try our best to understand what happened that night. First, the victims. They were Opie Hughes, 39, Mary Tyler, 37, David Maxwell, 20, Joey Johnson, 20, and Monty Landers, 19. Tyler was the assistant manager, Hughes was one of the staff, as were Johnson and Maxwell. Landers shouldn't have even been there that day, he just popped in to see the 2 young men. We know that the staff had already pretty much finished up for the night. They'd almost finished cleaning up the place, the money had been counted, and the franchise headquarters had been called and been told about the takings. During the call, though, some voices could be heard in the background, possibly the voices of the killers. That phone call was the last time anyone heard the staff speak, besides the killers, of course. At around 11 p.m., Mary Tyler's daughter, Kim, walked into the restaurant expecting to see her mom. What she found instead was an eerie silence. Perplexed, shouting her mom's name, she looked down at the floor. She panicked when she saw fresh blood. The cops were soon on the scene, but none of the staff could be found. At first, police assumed that some hijinks had taken place and the staff maybe had a fight, or someone had an accident, and possibly they were all nearby. No one thought massacre, but that's what it was. The next day, about 15 miles from the restaurant at a remote field close to an oil well, all 5 victims were found. The first police on the scene couldn't believe what they saw. It looked like an execution from a war crime photograph. All the victims were lying face down in the grass and dirt, their arms tucked under their bodies, their heads all pointing northward. 4 of them were close together, while the other body of Opie Hughes lay not so far away. They'd all been shot in the back of the head, with at least one of them also taking a bullet to the back. Danny Pirtle, who would lead the investigation, later said in court that it was plainly obvious how they died without having to wait for autopsy. What he didn't know is that the carnage he was looking at would become one of the worst unsolved crimes in modern U.S. history. Well, it remained unsolved for over 2 decades and to some extent still is partially unsolved, but we'll get around to that. As some of you sleuths out there already know, a lot of murders are committed by people very close to the victim. You rarely have to look further than a spurned ex-lover, a jilted friend, or an angry business associate to find the person responsible. But in this case, things just didn't look that way. The murderers got away with around $2,000 that night, but even so, killing 5 people over such a small sum didn't make sense. What's more, it wasn't as if the staff were all connected other than the fact that they worked together. Sure, the young guys were friends, but police knew fairly certain that they weren't involved in gangs or high-level drug activity, and they weren't prone to hanging out with women in their late 30s. The crime looked like the work of a maniac. But then, the most messed up killers out there don't tend to take the money too. They kill for fun, for sport, to attend to some crazed sexual fetish, but they don't usually run off with the loot. At first, the investigators wondered if the murders had anything to do with a methamphetamine ring that had filled the streets of Kilgore with that pernicious drug. They knew that the ring was looking for a new recipe for cooking meth. Aside from that, after prolonged binges, meth heads do tend to lose the plot sometimes. But when they spoke to the manager of the branch, the manager said, no way, those folks were not part of any ruthless criminal gang. They weren't meth sellers, and she believed they weren't even meth consumers. Speaking later of one of the 20-year-old men, she said, they were good, they were exceptional, they were good kids. The police started looking at Kim, Mary's 17-year-old stepdaughter. She recently started working at that KFC, and she had a somewhat checkered past for a young person. So much so, she spent some time at the Louisiana Home for Girls after exhibiting behavioral problems. But why would she have had her mother killed? Why would this young woman have a beef with a bunch of guys just a little older than her? That line of inquiry led to nothing because Kim had absolutely no reason to have anyone shot. It seemed to the police that a robbery had taken place, but perhaps one or more of the staff had refused to hand over the cash. Some kind of fight ensued in which one of the staff was injured. Not wanting to leave any witnesses, the gunman then abducted the staff and took them to that oil field to kill them. Still, the autopsy didn't state that anyone had died before anyone else. It revealed that all of them were lined up at the oil field and they were shot one by one. Only Hughes, who was dragged away, was shot separately. There were few clues to work with. Cops found a fingernail in the clothing of one of the bodies. They found traces of another human on Hughes's body, but the best clue was a bit of blood on the ground and a blood-stained napkin lying nearby. As we said, there was also some blood in the restaurant. It didn't look as though it had come from any of the victims. Perhaps the police thought one of the staff really had put up a good fight and injured one of the perpetrators. People came forward and said they saw a van at the restaurant that night, which could have taken the victims away, but there was no CCTV back then in the area, and those witness statements were vague at best. Police also looked at two men named Romeo Pinkerton and Darnell Hartsfield. They were cousins and they both had a checkered past, while another man linked to those two was also on the police radar. But then jail records seemed to point to the fact that Hartsfield was in jail at the time of the murders, so that trail went dry. Such a slaying, something of the utmost brutality, put a lot of pressure on the cops. That's not always a good thing. It can make police join too many dots, and as we all know, many an innocent man has gone to jail when the police can't quite look past the picture they've already formed in their mind. It's called having a cognitive bias, and quite a few people have spent time on death row because of it. The police were quick to join the dots when they were arresting a man named James Earl Mankins Jr. He had a pretty colorful rap sheet, mostly for drug convictions. Notably, Mankins' father was a state representative. Police discovered that the fingernail they found looked as though it came from him. He was also missing a bit of his. A man named James Rowe said he approached the police by himself a few months after the crime. That night, he said he saw men driving a van, and he noticed that in the back of the van were people wearing uniforms. What's scary is he said he heard them yelling and screaming. He also said the driver of the van was a white guy with long hair and a beard. That fit the description of Mankins, although Rowe was never asked to testify. Why people never approached him again, we don't know. It wasn't until 20 years later that he did testify, and he said he went to school with Mankins and the man in the van wasn't him. Later, in 1995, DNA evidence pointed to Mankins' innocence, and the case against him was dropped. Some years later, it would be discovered that this fingernail the police had been so dead set on investigating actually came from one of the victims. Mankins later told the press, the worst part was the 6 months in jail over there thinking about being put to death for something I didn't do. And more than likely, if it wasn't for that DNA, I would have been on death row. The case went cold again, and it looked as though they'd never find the killers. A detective later admitted that the police had spent way too much time focusing on Mankins. Tunnel vision is an investigator's worst enemy. So sometime later, the Rusk County Sheriff's Office called a former FBI agent named George Kinney and asked him to look at the case from different angles. It seemed to Kinney that, given the severity of the crimes, whoever had done it had very likely committed more crimes in the years that had passed. It would be fair to assume, he thought, that the murderers were in prison for crimes as he began his investigation in the early 2000s. In 2001, a forensic scientist named Lorna Beasley retested the DNA evidence the police had and ran it through something called the Combined DNA Data Indexing System. That way, she could ascertain if the DNA from the blood found at the crime scene matched the DNA of violent offenders currently behind bars. Two names popped up. They were Romeo Pinkerton and Darnell Hartsfield. She thought. Those guys were suspects at the start, but we rubbed them from the list past. When it was discovered one of them was in jail when the murders happened, that wasn't true. The cops had messed up in that regard. On the night of the slayings, he'd been out of prison 2 days, but the evidence still wasn't enough to charge the men for their crime. It took 2 more years for a Texas Attorney General prosecutor Lisa Tanner to get on the case. She had doubts about finding the culprits so many years after the crime. Witnesses were getting old, and she said there were quite a few holes in the entire story. She also realized that DNA evidence pointed to 3 men committing the crime, not 2. What she needed was DNA from one of the 2 suspects for whom she did have names. One of them was Hartsfield, and investigators got a break in 2003 when he was arrested. Now, investigators just needed a DNA sample from him, but he wasn't exactly forthcoming about that. So, investigators embarked on a plan that had fooled many criminals in the past, offering drinks or chewing gum and then testing the remains. With Hartsfield, they got an added bonus. He flat out refused to give investigators a DNA sample, and that was his legal right. He even stated that in a letter. Oops. Tanner later told the press this: "He told us he wasn't going to give us his blankety-blank DNA. And then he was so adamant about it, he wrote us a letter saying, 'I'm not giving you my DNA, and you can't make me give you my DNA.' And then, of course, he licked the envelope and sent it to us." In 2007, facing the death penalty due to the new DNA evidence, he admitted to murdering those 5 people. Still, he said he only did so because 5 life sentences was better than a shot of lethal drugs into the arm. Pinkerton also received 5 life sentences. Hartsfield has since spoken from his cell, and he hasn't changed his story of being innocent. He once said, "I might have had crimes that I did do. You know what I'm saying? But no one ever got hurt. I would never kill these people. And from day one, I have stated my innocence, and I'm still stating my innocence." The investigators say they have now joined the dots, and the picture they've come up with, they are sure is real. They say the guys, possibly 3 guys, heard someone talking about the takings that evening, but they mistakenly heard 15,000, not 1,500. Some reports we found said 2,000 was taken and some said 3,000, so we can't be sure just how much was stolen. Investigators think the robbery just went wrong, and for some reason they abducted the 5 people. Why they murdered them all, they just don't know. They admit that the crime cannot be said to be solved until that 3rd person is arrested. The DNA evidence found on Hugh's body does not match Hartsfield, Pinkerton, or Mankins, or anyone else in the DNA database. The guy we mentioned at the start, former Detective Pirtle, said, "I think about it every day, and I lie awake some nights with it on my mind. It's been a big part of my life, and though I'm retired now, I still want the 3rd person." Hartsfield fought his conviction, and in 2010 a court upheld it, saying the evidence against him was solid. He still claims his innocence today, saying the real killer is still out there. On August 18, 1989, 2 brothers named Eric and Lyle Menendez walked into a Big 5 sporting goods store in San Diego and bought themselves 2 Mossberg 12-gauge shotguns. These were no ordinary kids. They were what you might call ultra-wealthy Beverly Hills boys. They lived in a stunning palatial mansion in the heart of the playground of the rich and famous. A day after they bought the guns, their parents, Jose and Kitty, chartered a yacht and took the boys shark fishing, which is apparently nothing out of the ordinary for a family swimming in money. What is unusual is the next day the boys entered a room where their father was watching television and unloaded the shotguns on their mother and father. Welcome to one of America's most confounding true crime stories. First of all, they did it. They admitted to it, and that's that. They fired the shots, made damn sure both were dead, and then went to a movie to watch Batman. We kid you not. This sounds like a simple open and shut case, but just hold on a second because as you shall see, this bloody tale takes many turns. We're a long way from getting the Scooby-Doo rip the mask off criminal ending. Let's start by telling you how this family got so incredibly rich. We've seen the house, and it befits a queen or someone just as important who also has a penchant for buying big places such as Evander Holyfield. That multi-million-dollar property was bought with hard-earned cash. Jose Enrique Menendez escaped the Cuban Revolution and arrived on the U.S. shores just at 16 years old. He studied hard and a few years later had an accounting degree. He later met Kitty, a teacher, but she gave that up while Jose was making a ton of cash as an entertainment executive. Their children went to the best schools and grew up with everything a child might need in terms of material goods. They might not have been shown much love, but we'll get around to that later. Eric had an acumen for tennis and at one point was ranked 44th best male player in the country under 18. His grades weren't too impressive though. Lyle got into Princeton, but he was also on the bottom rung of the academic ladder and even got suspended for plagiarizing work. So we have two rich kids, one a university dropout, and the other a tennis hopeful. At the time of the murders, Lyle was 21 and Eric was 18. With a bit of hard work, both of them were pretty much guaranteed to be set for life. That house was well worth over $10 million, and we expect that the father might have said, "One day, kids, this'll be all yours." There's a chance that if Eric hadn't decided to remove his parents' faces with a hail of bullets, he might have been challenging the likes of Pete Sampras and Andre Agassi. Back to that fateful night. After killing their parents, they changed into some clean clothes, saw Batman, and then they dumped the guns. They returned home, and that's when they called the cops and pretended to be shocked. Lyle called 911 and tearfully he said, "Someone killed our parents." When the police arrived, Eric was rolling around on the lawn in the fetal position, howling in tears. How did it go down? The cops wondered. The investigation revealed that the murderers had just walked into the room where the father was watching TV and shot him in the back of the head. He died instantly and was almost decapitated. Kitty heard the shots and she entered the room, whereupon she was shot in the leg. She tried to run, but slipped on her own blood. While crawling helplessly on the floor, she was shot in the chest and arms. The coup de grace was a shot to her face, which left her unrecognizable. Both of them also had shots to the kneecaps. These execution-style murders looked to the cops like the work of organized crime, and for some reason the kids weren't suspects at the start. They didn't even go through gunshot residue tests to check if they'd used a gun. Seeing as they stood to inherit many millions, you would have thought they'd be prime suspects, but at first none of the evidence pointed to them doing it. Then, they did some reckless things. In the months after the murders, what we might call the mourning period, the two brothers were seemingly having the time of their lives. Lyle purchased a cafe because, hey, why not? He also got himself a very expensive Rolex and a Porsche Carrera. He wore one of the Rolexes to the funeral, and on the way there, in a limo, he talked about how he was going to the US Open. He was seen with his dearly departed father's secretary. She would later testify that Lyle had said, "Hey, Marcy, who said I couldn't fill my father's shoes?" That's because he was actually wearing his father's shoes. Marcy was not impressed and somewhat nonplussed about the icy statement. Eric got himself a new tennis coach. Both boys took trips and spent a fair bit of cash in London and the Caribbean. They bought condos in Marina del Rey and ate at some very expensive restaurants in LA, driving there at times in their deceased mother's Mercedes-Benz SL convertible. The cops, meanwhile, were looking at other entertainment executives that might have had a beef with Jose. He was, after all, well known for being crude and shrewd in business. They also looked into any mob connections, but no one really had any motive to kill Jose, and especially Kitty. If it was an assassination by an enemy, then Kitty was likely just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But who else might want to take both of them out, instead of just killing Jose and then escaping? Yeah, those kids were spending money like Mike Tyson after his first big paycheck. The cops were onto them, and so told one of Eric's friends to wear a wire and ask him if he did it. Eric said no, he didn't, but he did confess to his psychologists. That psychologist didn't breach doctor-patient confidentiality, but he did tell his mistress what Eric had told him. She then told the cops. At this point, the boys think that they're in the clear. Lyle's hired some bodyguards for when he goes shopping and spends thousands of dollars at a time. Both brothers have also just created a real estate and entertainment business called Menendez Investment Enterprises. The two were interviewed numerous times about their loss and what they wanted to do with the money. They saw fame and wealth ahead, and Eric even said they might get into politics. He said, "My brother wants to become president of the United States, and I want to be a senator and be with the people of Cuba." He even said he felt his father's ghost inside him, pushing him to do good in Cuba. People swallowed the story hook, line, and sinker, but the cops saw two rats. So the police have been told that the boys did it. They arrested Lyle since he was in California, and then Eric was arrested after he came home after playing a tennis tournament in Israel. The case wasn't simple, though. In court, a judge ruled that the therapy session tapes could be used as evidence, but the boys had hired the best lawyers and they fought that for over a year. Around 3 years after the murders, both boys were eventually indicted for murder. In both cases, the juries were deadlocked, which means they couldn't come to an agreement. The boys sat in court, sometimes in almost matching sweaters, looking like two wealthy Ivy League students who were on their way to the country club. How come they weren't immediately found guilty and sent to prison? Can you imagine if some poor dudes from South Central had admitted to the crime? Would they get a hung jury? The defense argued that both boys had been molested throughout their childhood, and that's why they riddled their parents' bodies with bullets, kneecapped them, and removed substantial parts of their heads. The defense was good. too very good. The Washington Post at the time called her a star attorney, adding that she was a 4'11", fire-eating, mudslinging, nuclear-strength pain in the legal butt. She told the jury about how these two noble young men had been savagely brutalized from infancy right up until the day their despicable parents got what they deserved. These two lost souls were both paragons of humanity, she argued. The angels had their youth taken away from them by two ghastly parents who couldn't keep their hands to themselves. You get the picture. She was convincing and delivered an oratory matching the words of William Shakespeare. The boys sobbed too and told a tale of household horror that wouldn't look out of place in hell. The defense lawyer told the jury that before the kids did what they did, they approached the parents and told them that if they didn't quit molesting them, they would go to the cops and ruin both of them. She said that those mean parents in no uncertain terms said, "Try that and see what happens." The two kids feared retaliation and had no choice but to go and buy 2 shotguns and then shoot the molesters down in a hail of bullets. As for that big spending, well, it was just a way of dealing with things. The thing is, was she telling the truth? Well, the two people who could corroborate what she said were both dead. A cousin did come forward and support the boy's story, so that counted for something. The brothers cried when questioned in court, and you might have felt pity for them, but the vast majority of the American public weren't buying it. The boys cried, and the public for the most part mocked what they said were crocodile tears. The skepticism was so rife that even Saturday Night Live mocked the brothers. The kids said the father was the instigator of the abuse, but the mother was also demonic in her own way. They said she was selfish, mentally unstable, and after eating a handful of benzos washed down with a quart of vodka, she could become violent. It worked for a while, but then there was a second trial, and in that trial, the judge would not permit the defense to use abuse claims. He also said that the jury couldn't vote for a manslaughter charge. On April 2, 1996, both brothers were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For 22 years, they didn't see each other, but then in 2018, they were housed in the same unit, and when they met, they burst into tears and embraced. They've both been married and done quite a few interviews. One of the brothers said in one such interview, "I'm the kid who did kill his parents, and no rivers of tears has changed that." In a famous interview, Eric says, "I'm just a normal kid." The interviewer says, "You're a normal kid who killed his parents." He then says in a hushed tone, "I know." He even added that he admired his father, saying he was everything that success was. Some supporters of the children say their father might not have been a physical kind of abuser, but he was a powerful man that ruled over the house with an iron fist. He was what you might call an overbearing father. Friends of the family have said that Jose was somewhat tyrannical and he bullied his own kids. A child psychologist who has reviewed the case said it was the younger brother who was the victim of most of the abuse, and the older brother defended him. He believes the boys told the truth and the public that mocked the boys are wrong. But why kill the mother and shoot her 10 times? The psychologist replied, "I've talked with the boys about this and it's something that they don't fully understand. She was a very painful part of their lives, throughout their lives, and a person who they would have seen as not protecting them. She would turn up the television set if one of them was off in another room being physically abused by their father." The cousin who corroborated the brother's story has also spoken out of late, and he still states that Lyle told him during his childhood that the father was doing things no father should ever do. Then you have people who say criminals often use such excuses when they're held accountable for a crime. One psychologist said, "They say whatever they believe will gain them a sympathetic ear, and thereby minimize unpalatable consequences. They may claim that they were abused when it never occurred." There are those that argue that the brothers didn't use the so-called abuse excuse and that they have been unfairly treated by the justice system and that people have mocked them. The journalists and documentary makers have slanted their stories to make them look spoiled, selfish, and ultimately culpable of a heinous crime. Perhaps the public has treated these boys harshly, only because some envy the boys' wealth. Maybe people have biases toward kids who are labeled as spoiled brats, or maybe they were spoiled and selfish and out for some inheritance. The mother might have been a pill-popping malcontent married to a tyrannical man whose yearning for success dehumanized him, but that shouldn't have resulted in them both being shot to pieces. Then again, you might question why those kids murdered their parents in such a fashion. Wasn't one bullet enough? Where did that rage come from? Maybe these kids deserve another trial and those abuse allegations should be accepted. Some say yay to that and others resoundingly say nay. We can't solve the mystery for you, and so there will be no Scooby-Doo reveal today. We can't lift the mask from the past and see what went down inside the walls of that mansion. We can say one thing for sure though, and that's that money can't buy happiness. When asking the question of how to get away with murder, there's no better place to start than the case of Samuel Little, a man that could have killed 93 people in the US over several decades. He He died in 2020 aged 80, but before he bit the dust, he let his story be known. He said he started killing people in 1970, and he kept on killing without detection for over 4 decades. He was eventually arrested in 2012, but it wasn't until a few years later, when he started confessing to many more crimes, that he became known as one of the worst of the worst. He told the authorities in lurid detail what he'd done, and his stories added up. But how did a guy get away with killing for so long? Well, there are a few reasons in the case of Little. Firstly, he moved around a lot, killing in 19 different states. He might have had a criminal record as long as your arm, but all that movement made it hard to connect him to various murders. When a criminal moves a lot, various police departments might not be working together, which was certainly the case when he started killing in the 70s. But perhaps the main reason why he evaded capture for so long was that he killed people who might not have prompted the most rigorous investigations. Many of his victims were very poor, some were homeless, and many were addicted to drugs or selling their bodies on the streets. Some people he killed were unidentified, remaining Jane Does. There was a matter of race. When Little confessed, he made people take a long, hard think about race and class. Wealthy white girls and women he stayed far away from, knowing that this would elicit a meaningful response from the police. Little told the Washington Post, "I'm not going to go over there into the white neighborhood and pick out a little teenage girl." In a separate interview, he echoed that statement, saying, "I never killed no senators or governors or fancy New York journalists, nothing like that. I kill a journalist, it'll be all over the news the next day. I stayed in the ghettos." He was actually picked out in a photo lineup by a woman who'd gotten away from him, but the district attorney's office said they were not comfortable prosecuting a man when the only witnesses were prostitutes. In his own words, "They was broke and homeless, and they walked right into my spiderweb." There's a theory related to police work in murder which states there are less dead people. They're less dead because they were less alive, meaning they were the most vulnerable folks in the society whose lives, in terms of how the authorities looked at them, weren't as important as other people's lives. One academic put it like this: "A great deal less pressure is felt by the police when victims of a crime comes from the marginal elements." Just about all of Little's victims could be said to have been less dead. And because he moved around so much when picking his victims, this was why he wasn't caught for so long. But not all serial killers go for this type of victim, and certainly not all serial killers have a colorful rap sheet. Sometimes it's quite the opposite. Take the case of Ted Bundy. He was a good-looking, charming, well-educated man that was proud to say he worked in politics on election campaigns. He was liked by the people he worked with. He was also greatly admired by the women he married and had no idea what he was up to in his spare time. What's even more shocking is one of his jobs was working as the director for the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission. When he killed, and by God he killed a lot, he usually chose pretty middle-class young women, many of whom were studying at university. These people did not fit into that less dead category that we just talked about, but Bundy didn't fit the mold of a maniac either. For that reason, he could hide in plain sight. There's no way Little could have done such a thing. Killers often look for ideal victims, just as companies look for a target audience. Bundy was seen numerous times by people in places where women had gone missing. People reported seeing a guy with his arm in a sling. If you didn't know, Bundy did this to make himself look more vulnerable and needy. Those people told the cops what he looked like, and later others would come forward and describe the man they had seen. The sketches looked just like him. The thing with Bundy was he was a psychopath. His narcissism made him think he was too clever for the cops, and he was able to use his so-called winning smile to gain people's trust. The authorities weren't exactly looking for a guy with a great job and a wife. He even once worked for the Department of Emergency Services and talked a bit about missing women. Part of his job was to look for women that he'd killed himself. He was basically armed with a kind of cloaking device based on society's biases, rather like what is depicted in the novel American Psycho. On top of that, they didn't have much forensic evidence to work with, and some of the bodies were missing. At one point, cops were looking for a guy named Ted since someone had given them that name. They had the description of his face and body, and they knew about the VW Beetle. One of his colleagues even called the cops and said, "I think Ted Bundy could be the man you're looking for." But then police received around 200 similar calls every day. Then, when the going got tough and bodies were being found, Bundy left the state. He started killing again, of course, but again, when different states are involved, it can be hard for police to link murders. There's an actual term for this called linkage blindness. Even an ex-girlfriend of his called the police and said she thought she had dated the killer. Her name was Elizabeth Kopfler, and it seems her story fell on deaf ears. It was only when the cops had computerized databases to work with that they realized that from the 26 names they had, one was Ted's. Later, when he was pulled over driving around Salt Lake City and his car was searched, police found these items: a ski mask, trash bags, handcuffs, a crowbar, lengths of rope, and an ice pick. That was pretty much the serial killer's starting kit. Bundy escaped from custody twice and killed again, but we won't go into that. In conclusion, he got away with it for so long for a few reasons. He just didn't fit the description of a killer. Moving across states created a linkage blindness, and of course DNA evidence wasn't available. While the cops did have an archaic database, Bundy might have been caught earlier if they had a kind of tracking technology they had today. But sometimes police just do very bad work, as you'll now see. In 1979, in a suburb of Bradford in northern England, a policeman turned up at a house to interview its occupant. His name was Peter Sutcliffe, the man that would later become known as the Yorkshire Ripper. That cop had a sketch to go on provided by some of the women who had escaped the clutches of this maniac, and the guy he talked to that day over a cup of tea looked identical to the sketch. When the cop went back to the station to tell the chief about the man, the chief shouted back, "Anybody mentions photo fits to me again will be doing traffic for the rest of their service." That chief was following one line of investigation, which is a reason why some killers have gotten away with their crimes for so long. Sutcliffe was married to a teacher and lived in a house on a quiet suburban street. And so yet again, he wasn't what police immediately thought of when they looked at the bodies of women that had been torn apart. He was interviewed by the cops 9 times before he was eventually arrested, and he killed quite a few times in between those interviews. It's natural for cops and the public to think of some kind of monster when we hear about people being eviscerated down dark alleys. In the past, sometimes werewolves were blamed for such crimes, but more often than not, the killer looks and behaves just like you and me. Police know better now, but there is little doubt that a man who lives a very ordinary life might be the last person police look at. In this case of bad policing, you could say the cops had a one-track mind. First, they said the killer only chooses prostitutes as victims, even having the gall to call non-prostitutes normal women. Police at first said one of the attacks on a girl was not the same man because the killer only chooses prostitutes. She survived and gave the police a description of Sutcliffe. She also said he definitely had a strong Yorkshire accent, which, if you know English accents, is pretty unmistakable. Police dismissed her story as not linked to the serial killings. When they finally realized the guy kills indiscriminately, they called one of the victims the first innocent person. These were the kinds of people on the job. They had closed minds. They weren't the best investigators. They also worked with paper, not computers. They had so many files after years of investigations that they had to reinforce the floor where they were kept. That didn't help the investigation at all. They finally got a break when a banknote was found hidden in one of the victim's purses. Sutcliffe had given her the money before he killed her, and when cops looked at the numbers on that crisp note, they had a list of places where it could have been used to pay people. One was T&WH Clark Holdings, where Sutcliffe worked. He was even interviewed there by the police. Still, even with an entire Ripper squad looking for him, he killed again and again. What happened next is one of the biggest police bloopers of all time. They received a recorded message from a man claiming to be the killer, although this man didn't have a Yorkshire accent. The man speaking to the head of the investigation said, "I'm Jack. I see you're having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you're no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started." Linguists who were hired said this accent is not from Yorkshire but Tyne and Wear in the northeast of England. They were right, and the cops were very, very wrong to pursue a line of investigation into this tape. They looked for the mysterious Jack rather than the Peter on their doorstep. Meanwhile, Peter kept on killing. The person who actually faked being the killer even called the police to say he lied, but for some reason they kept looking for Jack. The FBI's fairly new behavioral science unit went over to England and told the investigators, "You realize, of course, that the man on the tape is not the killer, don't you?" They said, "You're looking for a man with mental health issues who likely works as a driver." That theory was spot on. Then one of Sutcliffe's former friends wrote to the cops in Bradford. The anonymous letter marked priority number 1 went like this: "I have good reason to know the man you're looking for in the Ripper case. This man has dealings with prostitutes and always has had a thing about them. His name and address is Peter Sutcliffe, 5 Garden Lane, Heaton, Bradford, Shipley." He said he was with Sutcliffe one night and he likely killed someone. For some reason, that letter was just filed and left alone. The guy even went to the police station the next day and told the cops again he was pretty sure the killer was Sutcliffe. The report of that meeting mysteriously vanished. Sutcliffe was eventually caught, but only after he was pulled over on a traffic stop. Even when he was in handcuffs, the ignorance of the authorities didn't stop. When he stood in court, a prosecutor said, "While some of the victims were prostitutes, perhaps the saddest part of this case is that some were not. The last 6 attacks were on totally respectable women. As for what went wrong in the case, well, take your pick." The police were single-minded. They seemed to embrace a top-down structure in which newer cops could not criticize more experienced cops. They also likely discounted Sutcliffe as a possible perpetrator because of his normal home life. They followed false leads. They had way too much paperwork and dots didn't get connected. Those Yorkshire cops were behind the times when it came to understanding the minds of serial killers. Still, he didn't cross state lines and killed mostly close to where he lived. He should never have gotten away with it for so long. The British media rightly called the investigation stunningly mishandled. Sticking with Britain, let's have a look at the case of Dennis Nilsen, the serial killer that strangled boys and young men and then spent time watching TV with the corpses. This bespectacled man was well liked at work, where he held the role of executive officer in a civil service job. Prior to that, he'd been a soldier and even worked as a policeman. He was quiet and intelligent, so when he smelled of booze or took days off work to dismember and burn his decomposing victims, no one thought anything of it. He didn't just come across as normal, but so harmless that people felt a bit sorry for him. Nilsen drank heavily, and it was his astounding tolerance for alcohol that he used to subdue his victims. When he invited them around and plied them with booze, they collapsed in a drunken heap and he was just fine. Nonetheless, one guy survived Nilsen strangling him and he went to tell the cops. This is where the police again showed some amount of short-sightedness. They just dismissed the crime as a homosexual lover's tiff. This was the 80s when homophobia was rife among the English police forces. The cops, it seems, thought that what happened was consensual, and they didn't press any further when the man said he wasn't going to press charges. Another survivor of Nilsen didn't even report what happened to him for fear of being outed. A very similar thing happened in the US to a very similar kind of killer. Jeffrey Dahmer also enjoyed spending time with his dead victims, and he had a similar run-in with homophobic cops. Dahmer plied one of his victims with alcohol containing sleeping pills, after which he drilled a hole in the kid's head and injected hydrochloric acid. Like Nilsen, he had a thing about people leaving him. Dahmer wanted to create his own kind of obedient zombie. The kid eventually escaped, only for 3 women to find him in the street looking very confused and distraught. They called the cops, but when the police turned up, they didn't believe the women when they told them something was very wrong here. They believed Dahmer, though, when he arrived on the scene and told them they'd just fallen out. The police almost used the same words as the cops had done in the Nilsen case. They wrote it down as a lover's quarrel. Even though blood could be seen around the victim's backside, they helped walk the kid back to the apartment. One of the cops even noted how Dahmer's apartment smelled disgusting. That was because bodies were decomposing in there. It should also be said that Dahmer also had a criminal record involving sexual deviancy. Dahmer killed the teenager shortly after. With that in mind, we can come to the conclusion that some killers have evaded capture from time to time because of police discrimination. In both these cases, the cops either felt uncomfortable with homosexual men or had outlandish preconceptions in regard to what goes on in the gay community. In Dahmer's case, he certainly should have been on the police radar. He had a record and after arrests had been called a sociopath with sadistic tendencies by psychiatrists. They also said this man will strike again. He did, but one drugged man survived the ordeal. Dahmer was arrested yet again, with the psychiatrist this time saying he was seriously disturbed, impulsive, and dangerous. Still, Dahmer went back to the streets. He was only caught after one of his victims got away, still in handcuffs, and flagged down a cop car. As for Dennis Nilsen, he didn't have a history of criminality, and unlike Dahmer, from the outside he looked like a respectable office worker who just liked to spend a lot of time alone in his quiet, leafy London suburb house. It did seem, though, that the police turned a blind eye when it seemed obvious that Nilsen had seriously assaulted someone. We should also point out, in fairness to the cops, Nilsen did a pretty good job at disposing of bodies, at the start at least. Because the cops in London and elsewhere for that matter have been accused of such prejudice, they might at times have kept their distance. This could lead to negligence, and such stigmatization of the gay community could lead to serial killers getting away with crimes. We can't stress enough that keeping an open mind is very important where serial killers are concerned. Nilsen would likely have not been caught if he hadn't made a very big mistake. After being forced to move and not having a garden anymore to burn bodies, he had to make do with a flat to dispose of his victims. He did his best to chop them up and liquefy them, but what he shoved down the drain led to some blockages. He was actually one of the tenants that called the landlord and said something had to be done about those blockages. When some workers opened the drains, they discovered something horrible. What looked and smelled like bits of rotting flesh. Nilsen actually went outside and told the guys it was likely discarded KFC. There was no brilliant or particularly bad police work after that. After finding a head, arms, feet, and other body parts in his flat, Nilsen turned to the cops and said, "It's a long story. Goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest." He killed 12 to 15 people over a 5-year period, and as the English might say, the police didn't have the foggiest. Now, for the last one. What if there's a serial killer out there that is the worst you could possibly imagine, and yet police still haven't uncovered this crime? It's very possible. Richard Cottingham, aka the New York Ripper, is currently serving time in prison in New Jersey. Police know he definitely killed 11 people, most of them vulnerable young women who he brutally tortured before killing. He started in 1967, but wasn't arrested until 1980. Since he's been in prison, he's had a change of heart at times and admitted to more murders. In fact, he said he killed in the region of 100 people. He's spoken about it to the serial killer historian Peter Vronsky, but sometimes he says he can't recall what he did with some of the victims or their body parts. Cottingham was another family guy that no one ever expected of killing people. Never mind doing the atrocious things he did to his victims. He held down a very good job as a computer operator at an insurance company, and he was adored by his 3 kids. He was also not on the police radar when he was finally arrested. That happened because he was confident enough to try and kill a girl at the exact same hotel he'd mutilated and killed another girl just weeks earlier. When the staff thought they'd heard screams, they called the police, their minds still traumatized by what happened 18 days earlier. The question is, though, could this man be the most prolific serial killer ever in the US, and the cops just don't know about it? Well, as Vronsky points out in his books, there are massive gaps between his first murder and when he was caught. Cottingham said he never stopped killing in those 13 years, but he was only convicted of just a handful of murders. By the way, Vronsky was inspired to start writing about serial killers after bumping into Cottingham in a hotel after he just dismembered 2 women. When Cottingham got out of the elevator, his bag hit Vronsky's knees. It was heavy and it hurt. That's because there were 2 heads and 2 pairs of hands in that bag. In one of his books, Vronsky writes of the time when Cottingham was on the loose. On 8th Avenue north of West 42nd Street, there were so many hookers that the NYPD put up wooden barricades along the sidewalks to keep them and their pimps from spilling off the sidewalks onto the avenue and blocking traffic. At the time, the city was awash with crime, and there was in the region of 40,000 prostitutes working there. When Cottingham wasn't showing off his computer skills in his Manhattan job, he was frequenting a red light district, which was also an analog porn hub nicknamed The Deuce. Women and girls went missing a lot. In 1974, Marianne Pryor, age 17, and Lorianne Kelly, age 16, were last seen at a bus stop in the area. Their naked bodies were found later behind a parking lot. It wasn't until April 2021 that detectives, with the help of Vronsky, finally solved the case. Cottingham had savagely killed them both. Other cold cases were also solved after Cottingham's confessions. But did he kill 100 people? That's the riddle Detective Robert Ancelotti tried to solve for a long time. Over the years, he visited Cottingham, each time building up a kind of rapport to make him open up about what he'd done. One day, Cottingham just said, "I'm gonna give you one." He described a murder he committed, saying things only the killer would have known. Ancelotti told the New York Times in 2021 he remembers certain aspects of a person. One would remind him of a TV actress. Look her up, she looks like her. Others he remembered from a haircut. Unfortunately, since Cottingham didn't know his victims at all, he couldn't recall any names. Detectives are still working on many cases, so perhaps the extent of Cottingham's crimes will one day become known. He's getting old, though, and according to Ancelotti, getting anything out of him is hard. I think sometimes he grapples with his own gruesomeness back then, Ancelotti said. Richard Cottingham might be in prison, but it seems in some respects he's still getting away with murder. Lou woke up to the sound of gunshots coming from inside his house. There were panicked screams, sounds of a violent struggle. He sat bolt upright, terrified and drenched in sweat as he heard footsteps getting closer to his room. It had already been the worst year of his life, but things were about to take another turn straight into hell. And this time, Lou would bring a demon back with him. A figure trudged down the hallway toward Lou's bedroom door, having already taken 2 lives that night. He gripped a kitchen knife in his scarred, twitching hand, still dripping with the blood of its recent prey. He chuckled softly to himself, amused at the carnage of it all. Now he was going to add one more body to the pile, Lou's body. Back in his bedroom, Lou could feel his heart rise into his throat. The door creaked open and he saw the figure looming in the shadows. "Jeff?" Lou asked, seeing the figure slowly come into focus. "Is that you?" The figure chuckled again and raised his index finger up to its lipless mouth. "Shh," he said, "go to sleep." Before Lou could get another word in, the figure, presumably his brother, Jeff, charged at him brandishing the blade. He couldn't help but notice that his brother's white hoodie was already spattered with blood, and that he'd cut a wide, Joker-like grin into his own face. The awful sight of his brother's ruined face caused him to let his guard down just for a moment. Big mistake. Jeff, who'd seemingly gone utterly insane, had no intention of cutting him any slack. In fact, his only intention was to cut him. Jeff stabbed Lou in the belly, causing a shockwave of pain to rock through his body. Worse than the pain was the sense of betrayal. His own brother, who he'd sacrificed so much for, was genuinely trying to kill him. Lou cried out in pain, sending tears cascading down his cheeks. Jeff stabbed him again and whispered, whispered, "I said go to sleep," just like Mom and Dad. In that moment, Lou connected all the dots. The gunshots he'd heard earlier, they were blasts of his father's shotgun, fired off in an unsuccessful attempt to save him and his wife from their youngest son's wrath. Jeff's mother had been the one that first discovered him in the bathroom, mutilating his face into a nightmare we know and fear today. Where she saw fear and disgust, Jeff had seen beauty and potential. His mother would be punished dearly for not seeing what he saw. She ran back to the bedroom and implored her husband to grab the gun, knowing on some primal level that her son was already gone. But they were too slow. By the time 2 shells were loaded into the gun, Jeff was already running across the room, knife at the ready. His father unloaded both barrels, but Jeff, now imbued with a killer instinct, was able to dodge the buckshot. A few minutes later, when Jeff left the room, both of his parents were dead and gutted on the bed. Lou would be next, unless he got extremely lucky, or depending on your perspective, extremely unlucky. He could feel himself getting lightheaded from the pain as Jeff twisted the knife in his guts, cackling like a madman while he did it. Lou tried to hit his brother and throw him off, but Jeff was too strong. He seemed to just ignore the pain. As he prepared to plunge the knife into Lou once more, Lou reached out onto his bedside table and grabbed the first thing his desperate hand could get a hold of. Not a weapon, but a rosary. In sheer panic, he wrapped the rosary around Jeff's neck and began to pull it tight until he could begin to see his brother strain and wheeze. His grip on the blade was getting looser. His pale face was slowly becoming a ruddy purple from the oxygen deprivation. All the while, Jeff slashed at Lou, leaving a crisscross of deep cuts on his face and torso. With the last of his strength, Lou reeled back and delivered a powerful kick to Jeff's gut, knocking his brother off his body. Outside, police cars were converging in the suburb. Jeff and Lou's neighborhood was a quiet place, so gunshots and screams in the middle of the night were certain to catch people's attention. Incidentally, they'd arrived just in time to save Lou's life, but as everyone would later learn, this isn't necessarily a good thing. When Jeff saw the red and blue flashing lights, he decided to cut his losses and split, leaving Lou to bleed to death on the bed. Thoughts of sadness and betrayal swam through Lou's head as he lost consciousness, expecting to never wake back up again. His entire family was already dead or murderously insane. The one question now was which one of these Lou himself would become. How had he gotten here? Life seemed so normal a few months back when they were moving into the neighborhood. It was him, Jeff, and their parents. Lou and his parents had never really seen eye to eye. Jeff was always the golden child. They wrote off Lou early as a future burnout, but he and his brother were thick as thieves. Lou was incredibly protective of Jeff and would happily put everything on the line to keep him out of trouble. He just didn't expect that he'd need to do it so quickly. The incident at the bus stop changed everything. He and Jeff were just standing there, minding their own business, when Randy, Keith, and Troy, a local gang of teenage thugs, rolled onto the scene. What started as a hostile conversation quickly turned into a straight-up shakedown, as the 3 bullies all pulled blades and threatened Jeff and Lou to hand over any money or valuables they had on him. That's when Jeff had his first little snap. Just recalling it terrified Lou. It was the first time his sweet little baby brother didn't seem like himself, like a switch had been flipped in his brain. He gave Randy a brutal punch to the nose before grabbing and snapping his wrist. Jeff then effortlessly disarmed him and used his knife to stab Keith in the arm. It was almost like some outside force had taken over him. Lou had known right then, on some level, that things would never be the same again, but there would still be a lot of pain in store for Lou before Jeff the killer would truly be born. Randy and Keith needed to go to the hospital. As a result, the authorities soon came knocking on Jeff's door. However, Lou had no intention of letting Jeff go to juvie for this. His brother may have been frightening in his brutality, but he was still acting in self-defense. The bullies had threatened them first. Lou did the only thing he could to protect his brother from his own impulsive actions. He confessed to Jeff's crimes and accepted the charges. Because his parents had always thought so little of him in the first place, they were happy to believe that he was behind the assault and let him take the fall for it. Lou was sentenced to a year in a brutal correctional facility for his trouble, but at least he'd done what he believed was right and kept his brother safe. His time inside wasn't so kind to him. Lou might have been innocent, but many of the teens around him were hardcore criminals in the making. He was dealt regular beatings by the other inmates and the sadistic guards. Night after night, alone in his cell, separated from anybody who cared about him, was beginning to take his toll. Everyone thought he was a monster. Sometimes a tiny voice inside him would whisper, "If they already think you're a monster, why not start playing the part?" In these moments, he'd always fantasize about committing violence, about getting back at the people who hurt him, who put him here, but he'd always suppress the urge. He had to be good. If he became a monster, what would Jeff think of him? Little did he know Jeff was becoming a monster in his own right. He'd been grappling with his own urges to kill, and when Keith, Randy, and Troy showed up for a revenge at the birthday party Jeff was attending, the floodgates finally opened. They'd arrived at the party with guns, fully intent on killing Jeff, but things ended up very differently for the would-be murderers. Giving in to his darkest urges, Jeff slaughtered each and every one of the bullies with increasing ferocity. His mind snapped. He became entirely a different person, with only one directive in mind: kill. However, as almost everyone knows by now, Jeff didn't come out of the conflict unscathed. Due to a mix of fire and chemical burns, he was left horrifically physically disfigured and barely clinging to life. When Lou heard the news in juvie, he was horrified. He regretted every decision he ever made. If he hadn't taken the fall for Jeff, he wouldn't have been left in harm's way. But there was one silver lining. Before his death, Randy confessed to attacking Jeff and Lou first, in front of several reliable witnesses. Their testimony was at least enough to exonerate Lou, allowing him to return home to his family to support Jeff. When the wrappings around Jeff's face were taken off and his new disfigurements were revealed for the first time, Lou was the first to comfort him, telling him it didn't look too bad, and he got almost slashed to ribbons for his trouble. When Lou woke up in the hospital, he practically looked like Frankenstein's monster, covered in stitches all over his face, arms, and torso where Jeff had been cutting into him. Something felt different, not just physically, but mentally. He felt almost as though there was a different person trapped in his brain with him, watching him, trying to take control of his actions. There was a single nurse in that room, attending to his injuries. He asked her what had happened, and she replied that he'd been in a coma for a few weeks now. His brother had murdered his entire family, and since then he'd been on a nocturnal killing spree across the country. He'd been behind a number of murders and disappearances and had consistently managed to evade capture. "You're very lucky to be alive, young man. I've seen the police sketches," the nurse said. "The little freak looks like a demon. I'd hate to run into him in a dark alley." Demon? Something about that word and the tone she took really got under his skin. He may have been a murderous psychopath, but Jeff was still Lou's brother, and he didn't want anyone bad-mouthing him after what he'd been through. Lou suddenly felt this burning rage inside of him, and a little voice inside his head spoke up again. "Kill her. Kill her now. She deserves to die." That's when Lou noticed a pair of surgical scissors on a table next to his bed. With a sudden surge of almost supernatural strength, he reached over and grabbed the scissors. As the nurse approached to restrain him, he stabbed her through the eye with the scissors, piercing her brain and killing her instantly. He had finally given in to his darkest urge, and it felt good. Fantastic, even. He hadn't felt so alive in years. He climbed out of bed, feeling like a new person. The voice inside his head told him he needed to run now. If they caught him, there would be no more victims. There would be no more fun. And most importantly of all, if he got caught, he'd never see Jeff again. The now homicidal Lou climbed out of the window of his hospital room and slinked off into the dark, that little voice inside his head encouraging him all the way. He needed to kill again, and he needed to find Jeff. Perhaps he'd kill him. Perhaps they'd kill together. He wasn't sure. But one thing was for certain, he thought with a twisted smile. When he ran into Jeff again, they'd have plenty more in common. A woman meets a guy online, and after the two exchange some sweet words, they agree to meet. Fast forward just a couple of weeks, and the scene is a hotel room. A man stands above the body of a woman. She's been stabbed 30 times. Blood is all over the place. The man, who seems to have murder written on his DNA, will later say he feared the woman was going to reject him. But get this, the authorities knew this man was a killer. In fact, they should have seen the signs he was going to do it again. There are usually signs, and as you'll see today, they're not always exactly hidden. Okay, so we guess we shouldn't start a story and not fill in the gaps. The crime we just talked about happened recently in Canada. The authorities did take a lot of flack for it because they really should have known this guy might kill again. Going back to his earliest relationships, he had a history of violence. In fact, he was convicted of assaulting a partner years back. Then in 2006, he ruthlessly beat another partner with a hammer and then stabbed her as she lay dying. This was murder. He later said he was afraid she was going to reject him. He was, of course, arrested and sent to prison, but then he went from being high risk to moderate risk, and in 2019 he was allowed out of prison on day release so long as he followed some protocols. He was then sent to live in a halfway house. It was around this time that his parole officer said he should be allowed to tend to his sexual needs. Since you know how the story ends, you know that this was an extremely bad idea. What happened is the guy met the woman online, on an erotic massage parlor's website. They met a bunch of times, but then it seems he formed a kind of attachment to her, or more like an obsession. Paradoxically, he killed her because he thought she might leave him. He was obviously a certified loon and a very dangerous man. Okay, so what are the signs something like this might happen? Well, in his case, there was a history of violence against women, terrible violence, the worst kind of violence. He shouldn't have ever been allowed anywhere near a relationship, or at least his activities should have been monitored more closely. He was supposed to tell his parole officer about any relationships, which it seems he did. As we said, the authorities were criticized for this and admitted wrongdoing. But let's say you're the woman in the case. How would you know that this guy had murder on his mind? Well, there are plenty of resources that you can go to where experts tell you about behavior that could turn deadly. This could be behavior of both men and women, of course. One thing to notice is controlling behavior. You should know that if someone is excessively controlling, and we don't mean telling you off for forgetting to brush your teeth at night, alarm bells should be going off in your head. Let's say someone tells you what to wear all the time. This person keeps saying you dress too sexily. He's jealous. More than jealous, he's oppressive. Well, you should get out of that relationship ASAP. This is not normal behavior. It means this person has a problem, likely stemming from his childhood. If the control worsens over time, the person can't be talked to or doesn't take well to criticism, the behavior will only get worse. The end point could be violence and even murder, especially if the person feels you're going to leave. This is quite common. There are a lot of insecure people out there, but at times they might exhibit other strange behaviors, such as excessive aggressiveness during sex. Then you have stalking or threats of violence, even threats of murder. We're not talking about serial killer behavior here. That's very different, a whole different world. We're talking about people who cannot control their emotions and anger, people who may not have killed before but have it in them to kill. Perhaps you have a friend who you fear is in this kind of relationship. Sometimes the problem is that they don't talk about it, but if you find yourself saying things like, "She became quiet and withdrawn," or "She acts different when he's around," then this could spell trouble. Have a heart-to-heart with this friend when you get the chance. In all likelihood, if she's in a bad relationship with a controlling person, that person won't want her to meet you. He will be jealous of everyone, even her friends. In fact, research says that jealousy is one of the leading causes of spousal murder. Controlling and jealous people are responsible for a good chunk of murders in the world. You might think that murdering a lover or partner is only for natural-born killers, but you'd be very wrong. People kill in explosive fits of temper, so-called normal people, not just maniacs and psychopaths. You probably know that very often murder victims are killed by people intimate with them or friends. Take this case, for example, a really famous case in the US. It involved a NASA astronaut named Lisa Marie Nowak. In short, she liked a man, but that man was dating another woman, and this made the space woman very angry. Nowak was educated to the nth degree. She was well-loved and had a happy childhood, had money, fame even, but then in a fit of rage she set off to meet that woman with what the press called a kill kit in her car. That was a bag containing a steel mallet, a long knife, a length of hose, latex gloves, pepper spray, a BB gun, and some garbage bags. You have to ask what she was planning to do with those things. Thankfully, she didn't kill the woman. She hardly even spent any time in jail, just 2 days. Yeah, imagine she'd been poor and uneducated, it would likely have been a different outcome. The authorities said she was planning to do serious bodily injury or death. It was later written that she was jealous and obsessed, and that's why she had almost a fatal attraction. One expert said this about the case: "They may have murderous, rageful fantasies about that person. The difference is she is acting on those fantasies." Murder doesn't happen often as a result of jealousy, but it still happens way too often. You should know the signs. This is a good example of someone falling off the edge. She was controlling, jealous, obsessive. Unfortunately, these signs aren't always obvious from the get-go. These types of people tend to hide their problems at the start of the relationship, and then the negative emotions tend to slowly emerge as fangs do from growing tigers. Get out before it's too late. It's what experts will tell you. Regular people don't have the equipment that neuroscientists have. They can't scan images of a partner's amygdala and hypothalamus as they tell them that they think someone else is hot and charming. In such a case, if those parts of the brain show lots of activity, this means they could be extremely jealous. According to the experts, jealous folks in this case might also have fast-beating hearts along with muscle tensing and sweating. You can try that one at home. We looked at statistics, and while crime is a huge reason for homicides and sociopolitical murders are very common, much of the murder in the world is down to interpersonal conflict, meaning people being murdered by people they know because something went wrong. Often, it's jealousy. When we're talking about signs of a murderer related to criminal enterprises, well, it's complicated. Should Joey Icepick Inzaghi have seen the signs before he was whacked by Tony the Wizard of Odds Trevisani? Maybe not, because killing is in most mafia guys' playbooks. Still, as any former mafia guy will tell you, some of those good fellas were pretty much psychopaths who enjoyed killing. They killed for fun. They weren't right in the head. What's up with those guys? What are the signs they might display? Well, in terms of serial killers, be it sexual killers or demented maniacs that enjoy murdering lots of people, there could well be signs in childhood. There's something called the McDonald Triad, which is a controversial theory that people who commit serious violent offenses have 3 things in common when they're young. Those are bedwetting until a later age, setting fires all the time, and cruelty to animals. Okay, so lots of kids do this and they turn out to be nice people who would not dream of seriously hurting anyone, although excessive cruelty to animals could be a sign that someone is taking their anger out on vulnerable things due to the humiliation they suffered in childhood. Stable kids don't generally set cats on fire for fun. Still, this might not be a sign someone will kill humans. They might become very self-aware and ashamed of their act, and begin to understand why they did it. The author Peter Vronsky, who's arguably the world's most renowned writer about serial killers, has said with many of the killers he's researched, there are many themes that cross over. He kept to himself is the refrain you so often hear about serial killers. It's uncommon for a serial killer to be judged completely mad, at least in court, because people don't want this person to ever see the light of day again on the outside if they're released from a mental institution. American serial killer Herbert Mullen, for instance, thought God was telling him to kill people to prevent earthquakes from happening. With one of his victims, he cut out her organs and then spread her intestines around branches in some woods. He then inspected them for signs of pollution because he'd been told by the voices in his head that she was infected by the devil. Experts now agree he was without a doubt experiencing intense hallucinations because he had a bad case of paranoid schizophrenia. Are there signs when this happens? That's difficult to say, but if you meet someone who keeps ranting about the end of the world and the fact forces of evil are doing things only they understand, it could be a sign, especially if that person looks lost and what he says is very frightening, or if they might be in QAnon. Just recently, a British man killed his neighbor after a long time suffering from paranoid delusions. He believed his neighbor was spreading the COVID virus for Russian President Vladimir Putin, and he also thought he was under surveillance by NASA, the CIA, and the FBI. In 2019, he was detained under the British Mental Health Act, but he was released in 2020. In 2021, he shot his neighbor to death and later died in a high-speed police chase. This is what his father said about him. Alex was mentioning NASA, the FBI, the military. In the end, I think he thought he was some sort of secret agent. He was always talking about Putin. He got really bad at one point. You cannot speak to him without him saying something about torture and that people were spying on him. So if you know anyone like this, get them some help, or at least give them a wide berth for a while. Such signs are something to be concerned about. Then there's a lack of conscience, sometimes for an act someone has done, but also sometimes when they have witnessed something terrible. This could be related to psychopathy, but we say could with emphasis, so don't go thinking just because your friend laughs at news reports in which people die, he could soon be a killer. It's just a trait of some killers. In fact, they don't seem bothered at all by extreme acts of violence. The question a lot of people ask is, are we all capable of murder? It's a very difficult question to answer. You could take a person who has never committed a severe violent act, but many things come together at the wrong place at the wrong time. A lot of people who've killed say they don't remember doing it, as if they were temporarily blinded by rage. If you look closer, it's likely this person had been under tremendous amounts of stress. They might have childhood trauma issues, and possibly due to a head injury, their prefrontal cortex might not be working the way other people's do. Most of you will have the ability to use that bit of the brain and push back more animal instincts, but some people might not be able to do that. There's a lot of research that says trauma in childhood might affect how the prefrontal cortex develops, and since neglect and violence can be linked to poverty in childhood, this might be one of the reasons why more murders happen among poorer communities. An early sign of this could simply be someone you know who flies off into a rage very easily and seemingly cannot be brought out of it. We're not saying they'll be killers, but it's likely they have more chance of killing than someone who seems to have solid control over their emotions. We have morals and reasoning and a conscience, but we also have rage circuits in our brains that were developed a long time ago. As many a scientist has pointed out, we are hardwired to snap. Nonetheless, we generally don't snap and kill. It usually takes that perfect storm, or we should say imperfect storm, to blow into our lives. At times, we may need to snap in order to protect ourselves and others, but unfortunately, snapping for some people happens not in self-defense. As one scientist put it, the modern world presses on the defense mechanism circuitry in ways that can lead to misfires. Try to be good, people. Don't misfire. It's April 21, 2005 at ADX Florence, America's Supermax prison, located deep in the Colorado mountains and also known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Inmates there spend 23 hours a day in soundproof 7 by 12-foot cells designed to prevent them from making any meaningful contact with the outside world or with each other. It's where the most violent and dangerous inmates in the country are housed, and because of this, the staff takes extreme measures to ensure the prisoners' safety, including constant video surveillance, especially when they gather outside for recreation time. And on this particular day, despite everything being seemingly routine that morning, the guards noticed something odd. There in the back corner of the yard, an area surrounded by 12-foot-high concrete walls topped with razor wire, was an inmate, lying bloodied and motionless. But how could a prisoner in the most tightly controlled prison in the US get murdered in broad daylight? And even when it turned out that that murder had been caught on camera, why did it take nearly 10 years to solve? This is what we're going to find out. Jose Guadian, a guard at ADX Florence, arrived at his job watching security monitors just after 7 a.m. After his partner showed up, they ensured all the monitors were recording and then began scanning for anything suspicious. You see, rec time is where the inmates go about a lot of their illicit business. This is because inmates at ADX Florence spend almost the entire day locked up in their cells, which are built from reinforced concrete and equipped with sliding doors operated remotely by the guards. Every cell has its own narrow slit of a window, angled so that the sky is the only thing visible, preventing inmates from establishing any kind of connection to the outside world. Meals are delivered through small slots and showers are automated within the cells, all to minimize human contact and reduce the risk of violent incidents. This meant that rec time is one of their few opportunities to break the rules. Exchanging drugs, passing notes, and handing off weapons were all things Jose and his partner would be watching for. Just before 8 o'clock, the first groups of inmates began walking into the rec yard. As prisoners start doing push-ups, burpees, and other calisthenic exercises, Jose and his partner scanned the hands and the feet of the inmates, looking to see if anyone passed or dropped anything. The pair continued scanning until at 8:21 a.m. they spotted an inmate lying motionless in the far corner of the rec yard. After confirming with his partner that what they were looking at was real, the pair phoned the head of prison control, Paul Middleton. Paul immediately called a security alert. As soon as he did, every door in the prison slammed shut, except for a set that ran directly to the rec yard. With sirens blaring all around him, Paul wheeled a giant cart full of non-lethal weapons outside of his office. Every officer that ran by could grab a pepperball gun, a beanbag rifle, a baton, anything they needed to face the inmates. As guards in the facility responded and made their way into the prison yard, they didn't immediately rush in. Instead, they formed a perimeter around the yard. This is because prison rules dictated in these scenarios, guards must maintain a 3-to-1 balance of power over the inmates. The prisoners at ADX Florence are so dangerous, and with so many of them in the yard, they couldn't risk being overwhelmed. So instead, the officers began to call them one by one to walk backward toward the prison walls, where individual prisoners could then be handcuffed and brought back into their cells. Only once enough inmates had been removed like this would the ratio of guards to prisoners be high enough that officers could clear the rec yard. Medical staff, though, did immediately make their way to the downed inmate, and what they found shocked everyone. There, lying in a pool of his own blood, was an inmate who was so beaten that when medical staff tried to identify him, they couldn't, since his face was completely covered in bruises. When they attempted to identify brain functioning by shining a light in his pupils, they were unable to do so since his eyes were swollen shut. Medical staff later commented that his injuries were akin to what they had seen from people who had jumped from a nearby Royal Gorge Bridge, which was a 1,000-foot fall. Though medical staff could not get a pulse, they began CPR and they called for an ambulance. The prisoner was declared deceased at the hospital, but it is likely he died while still at the prison. As the prisoner was being transported into the hospital, though, correctional officers were busy bringing inmates to their cells, and that's when they got their first clue. Guards noticed that one of the prisoners, Richard Chuco Santiago, had blood all over his shoes. When they realized the significance of this, they came back to his cell and seized his clothing. But when they got there, Santiago was busy dunking his clothes and shoes into his prison toilet. Guards ordered him to stop, but he ignored them and started washing them faster. When threatened with a forceful extraction to stop him from destroying potential evidence, Santiago finally allowed the officers to handcuff him, and they entered his cell. As this was happening, prison officials were also reviewing the video recordings to see if the cameras had picked up anything. In ADX Florence, nearly every inch of the facility is under constant surveillance, with the video feeds running 24/7. During the video review, the officers finally discovered the identity of the victim. His name was Manuel Tati Torres, and he was a known leader of the Mexican Mafia. The tape showed Torres doing some toe touches in the back corner of the yard when two men came into the frame. The first was Santiago, the man who had been caught cleaning his clothes in his cell, and the second was another inmate named Sylvester Chicale Rivera. As Santiago approached Torres, Torres extended his hand as if to shake Santiago's, when all of a sudden Santiago cocked back his fist and punched Torres in the face. The first blow knocked him to the ground and just out of view of the camera, but Santiago and Rivera could still be seen punching, kicking, and stomping Torres for a full 6 minutes. The killers were so brazen and nonchalant about the attack that during the assault, Santiago even took a quick breather to grab a drink of water before going back in on Torres. The next day, officers went to Rivera's cell to detain him. When officers arrived, he was visibly shaking but cooperative. As he was being led away, he asked if the deputies were mad about what he did. When they didn't respond, he asked about what had happened in the rec yard yesterday, wanting to know if it was truly the first time a murder had happened at ADX Florence. "What I did," he said. "I heard it made the news." Not wanting to taint any additional statements, the corrections officers advised Rivera to stop talking and wait for the investigators to come. But who exactly were these people, how did they know each other, and why did they want to murder one of them? All three men were affiliated with the Mexican Mafia, which was born out of the cesspit that was the California Juvenile Detention Program in the 1950s. And the whole idea behind the gang was to unite Mexican-American gang members under one common banner while in jail. The gang recruited heavily and based their operation on the Italian mafias that were prominent in the American Northeast at the time. The organization had strict rules. Members had to follow all orders from made members no matter what, up to and including murder. Backing down from a fight, snitching, or trying to leave the gang were all grounds for immediate execution. And soon the gang's hyperfixation on extreme violence earned it a fearsome reputation. So much so that the California prison authorities tried to clamp down on the organization by dispersing the gang to other parts of the state. But that ended up having the opposite effect. Like a cancer, the Mexican Mafia, which was now spread out, only grew more powerful. Over the years, as members made parole, they established sects throughout California, where they continued their drug trafficking, prostitution, extortion, and murder-for-hire rackets on the outside. The Mexican Mafia, now known as La M, or the M in Spanish, became an extremely powerful gang both inside and outside the California prison system. Its core membership consisted of around 750 made members who controlled up to 50,000 associates and foot soldiers at any given time, who all had aspirations to become a full-fledged member. And the only way to do that was to commit a murder in the name of the gang. So where did these three men fall in this organization? Manuel Torres was a senior leader in the organization, first joining the gang in the 1960s. He quickly became a powerful figure in Southern California. His main racket was an extortion business that charged drug dealers and drug users a tax to buy and use drugs in his territory. He would then take a percentage of the cut and send it back to incarcerated members to help them live a more comfortable life on the inside. In 1997, Torres was one of several dozen Mexican Mafia members arrested in a giant operation. At first, Torres was sent away to do his time at Lompoc, a federal institution several hundred miles away from Los Angeles. However, once at Lompoc, Torres united all the Hispanic gangs on the yard under the banner of La M and began terrorizing the other prisoners. After running out of options to limit his power, state prison officials decided the only way to beat Torres was to ship him off to ADX Florence, where he could hopefully be controlled. As for Santiago, he was a fully made member of the Mexican Mafia and, like Torres, had also been imprisoned at Lompoc. A career criminal, Santiago earned his way into the Mexican Mafia by killing a fellow inmate in 1989, which got him a life sentence. Continuing to be unruly, he was eventually shipped off to ADX Florence in 2000, and he and Torres arrived there around the same time. Then there was Sylvester Rivera. Rivera was a longtime associate of the Mexican Mafia, a career bank robber who brought in huge sums of cash for the group, but had not been made a full member yet. After getting caught, Rivera continued to break prison rules in every institution he was at, from using drugs to making contraband wine, fighting, and trying to escape. Rivera was a problem child no matter where he went. After dealing with him for years, it was decided ADX Florence was the only place for him, and he arrived in March 2005. But even though all of these men were bad guys, it was still a homicide. The truth needed to be found out. But because the institution was federal property, the FBI would handle the investigation. And the person in charge of finding out the truth was a man who will only be known as John. In order to keep his identity a secret, John has only revealed a few details about who he was. He would later tell a reporter who investigated the case his first name, that he grew up in a very Christian southern town, and he came from a large police family. All other details had to be limited to protect himself and his family, and the reporter would soon learn why this was the case. After being assigned the case, John first went to the facility to speak to the inmates who were in the yard that day. As he made his way to the prison complex, an immense feeling of dread came over him. The complex was situated in an absolutely beautiful part of Colorado, surrounded by picturesque mountains, but the facility itself was ominous, cold, and eerily quiet. When John arrived, he asked the prison officials if they had an interview room he could use to speak to the inmates. They told him yes, they did, but no, he couldn't use it. You see, one of the worst things a prisoner can do is talk to a cop. The others see it as a betrayal, and so even the suggestion that someone had spoken to him about the murder and potentially snitched in any capacity would be enough to get them killed. John would have to come up with another way to speak with the inmates without letting the others know. To protect their confidentiality, John set up a makeshift office in a secluded part of the prison. Correction officers would take away one prisoner at a time with a made-up reason for their removal. This could be under the pretext of a doctor's appointment, a meeting with an attorney, a dental appointment, or some other mundane reason. But despite this, it didn't take long for the prisoners to figure out what was going on. One time, after several prisoners had been brought in under the guise of a dental appointment, other prisoners remarked that they didn't realize they had so many issues with their teeth. And just because they weren't talking to John in the official interrogation room, that didn't mean they would be any more cooperative. After the guards sat down the potential witnesses, many would unleash a flurry of profanities as soon as John flashed his FBI badge. Others remained even more defiant, and they refused to say a single word at all, and they would stare at John in silence until he gave up. In fact, during John's visit to ADX Florence, not a single inmate made any statement whatsoever about what happened that day, nor anything about Torres, Santiago, or Rivera. It seemed as if the entire population of several hundred inmates had either been sworn to secrecy about what happened, or they had been threatened. Either way, John realized he wasn't going to get anything out of them, and he was forced to leave ADX Florence empty-handed. But John wouldn't give up that easily. Not willing to be defeated, he teamed up with the assistant U.S. attorney Bob Midens, a career prosecutor who had made a name for himself in the Denver office as someone who could take on even the most complex legal cases and win. Together, he and John devised a new strategy to try to figure out what had happened, but they would need expert help to do this. The experts they chose were members of the FBI field office in Los Angeles. Here, the Intelligence Bureau had several resident experts on La M, and they knew practically all the players. When the duo met with the FBI officials in Los Angeles, they were stunned at the amount of information they had gathered on the gang. Inside the FBI office, there was a literal library of information documenting nearly every crime and every member of the group that they knew of. Not having much time, they received permission to copy most of the documents there and bring them back to Colorado for review. But that wasn't the only thing the FBI gave them there. In addition to the documents, they handed over a list of former Mexican Mafia members who had turned state witness for various trials. These former gangsters had signed their own death warrants because of this, and they were all put into the Federal Witness Protection Program. As part of the deal to help them, the FBI field office in LA gave John and Bob a list of Mexican Mafia defectors. However, they did not give them information on what they had done in their previous lives, nor did they promise their cooperation. But this was still their best shot at understanding La M and why Torres might have been marked for death. With that, John and Bob went on a countrywide tour, interviewing ex-gangsters to figure out the truth. Though many were unwilling to involve themselves, they did speak to enough people to learn the following secrets about the gang. In La M, once you're marked for death, it doesn't matter if the decision was made months, years, or even decades ago, it was still a valid order. Members marked for death never knew what was coming, and because Mexican Mafia members were spread throughout prisons in the U.S., it could take a long time for word to pass from member to member, confirming the hit. Once enough members had voted for death, word could travel via messengers throughout various prisons or on the outside. Because of this, it could literally take years before a member is released to relay a message on the outside. This is because, unlike other gangs, which sometimes have documents showing written rules or orders, the Mexican Mafia keeps no records. All confidential information is locked inside one place only, the members' minds, and it is only passed by word of mouth. So what had the defectors had to say about this case in particular? What cardinal sin of La M had he broken? According to them, the reason why Torres had been marked for death was because back in the early 90s, as he was taking over his extortion business, he had killed a fellow member to have it all for himself. It took several years for other members to find out Torres was behind the murder, and by the time they did, he had already been arrested in 1997 and then shipped off to ADX Florence in 2000. So, who was Santiago? It's been claimed that he was what's known as a torpedo. Torpedoes were hitmen specifically designated to carry out assassinations of marked men inside the prison system. So, for Santiago to be sent from Lompoc to ADX Florence around the same time as Torres shows that it is very possible his murder was planned years in advance. But how did Rivera fit into all of this? Because Rivera was not yet a fully made member, he needed to commit a murder to finish his gang initiation. In addition to this, Santiago would have to receive a verbal order from outside ADX Florence to confirm the kill order and then execute it with Rivera. Based on their witnesses, John and Ryan speculated that Rivera was a messenger who brought the order to Santiago, since within 3 weeks of Rivera arriving at ADX Florence, Torres was dead. Armed with this expert testimony and the treasure trove of documents provided by the LA field office, not to mention the video of the murder itself, The pair brought a 2-count murder indictment against Santiago and Rivera in 2010. But that is where the real hard work started. Because these prisoners were already serving time in the most brutal prison in America, the U.S. attorneys wanted to send a message to dissuade other inmates from committing extreme acts of violence. But how would they convince other prisoners who had nothing else to lose? After a year of investigation, the Justice Department's Capital Crimes Unit, or Death Squad as it's known, came back with their findings. The United States would seek the death penalty against Santiago and Rivera to dissuade similar crimes in the future. But there was just one problem: Rivera was a Mexican citizen. Under the Vienna Convention, Rivera had to be apprised of his right to counsel immediately upon apprehension for the crime, which corrections officers did not do when they took him from his cell. And while this might not have seemed like a big deal, to the nation of Mexico it was, and soon the Mexican ambassador actually got involved. He wrote letters to the Attorney General and the Secretary of State about Rivera's case. Because Mexico had abolished the death penalty, trying to seek it against a Mexican citizen was a very hot-button political issue. So under political pressure, Bob announced that he would not be seeking the death penalty against Rivera, but would continue to do so against Santiago. But then disaster struck. After working on the case for years, Bob suffered a sudden heart attack while skiing with his wife and died. John took the death of someone who had now become his close friend very hard. Because of Bob's passing, John recused himself from the case. In Bob's stead, U.S. Attorney M.J. Menendez took over. But who could help? Who had the knowledge of the case needed to finish it and get the final convictions? Sometimes you don't have to look very far at all, since it turned out that John had married a fellow FBI agent. After watching her husband handle the case for years, she had become intimately familiar with it, as she had been a sounding board for her husband. With John no longer having the heart to continue after Bob's passing, his wife picked up where he left off and worked with Menendez to prepare the Rivera case for trial. But there was still a big problem. Due to the secretive nature of the Mexican mafia and the government's inability to bring their confidential informants to court, the theory that John and Bob had developed about a hit that was years in the making, while sound, was no good in court. Due to the lack of hard evidence to prove the conspiracy theory, the prosecution wanted to rely on what they could prove, namely the videotape showing the attack. As the trial kicked off, there were some extreme security measures taken to protect all of those involved from reprisals from this shadowy quasi-terrorist organization. Each of the jurors was impaneled in secret. Their faces were not shown in court, and a 4-digit number was used for their identification. As for Rivera, he was shackled to a bucket filled with concrete and flanked by numerous U.S. Marshals ready to tackle him should he try to escape or do anything out of line. But just before the trial kicked off, Rivera's defense team brought up a surprise piece of evidence: an eyewitness. Over the past 10 years, the government had not been able to procure a single statement from anyone in the yard that day. But now, all of a sudden, before the trial, the defense team had found a prisoner who was suddenly willing to testify about the attack. There was a chance he could unravel the whole case against Rivera. So, how did the government claim the murder went down? According to them, Rivera had been sitting in his cell waiting on his turn to go out into the rec yard that morning. Due to an administrative error, the guards did not take him out at the correct time, and so Rivera had flagged down a passing guard to take him out to the rec yard. Meanwhile, video footage had captured Santiago walking up to a window and talking into it. Further investigation by John using drawings of the prison had proven that Santiago had been talking into Rivera's cell while he waited to get taken outside. Once outside, the duo began warming up for their workout in the same corner as Torres, as seen in the video footage. Santiago approached Torres and cold-cocked him, and then the two spent the next 6 minutes beating him to death. But this was a vastly different story from what the new defense witness testified about. Another full-fledged Mexican mafia member named Arcadio Perez came forward as the new witness. According to Perez, this is what happened. Perez said that Torres had apparently passed him a note stating that Rivera was disrespectful and had to be dealt with, and that because Rivera was not a made member, he could kill him with impunity. Perez later testified that these were not empty threats. According to him, Torres ordered Perez that at the rec yard that morning, they were going to attack and kill Rivera. At the signal of "let's go," they would pounce on him and beat him to death right there in the yard. For his part, Perez didn't want to do it. He said that he and Rivera were friends and he honestly liked the guy. However, Torres was a ranking member in the gang. Disobeying his order would mean a death sentence for himself. But was there any truth to what he was saying? Well, maybe.
According to prison records, Torres had utilized an inmate intercom system to talk to the guards that morning. Prisoners used this system since the guards didn't stay on the rec yard when they were out there. From guard testimony, Torres had been asking about where Rivera was. Because of this, it did seem odd that Torres was asking for Rivera, and the fact lends some credence to what Perez was saying. But why didn't he follow through? Perez stated that when he saw Santiago approach Torres and start fighting him, he backed off because now it was a dispute between two made members and he was not going to get himself involved. As a result of this, he stayed on the sidelines. But what did Rivera have to say about all of this? Much to everyone's surprise, Rivera took the stand in his own defense, and what he said had a ring of truth to it. According to Rivera, Torres didn't like him because he was close friends with several members Torres didn't like, likely because they were associated with the man Torres had murdered back in the early 90s. Because of this, Torres threatened Rivera's life on numerous occasions. Now, part of that does make some sense. Torres probably wanted everyone to forget about what he had done in the 90s. With several other ranking Mexican Mafia members imprisoned at ADX Florence, the fact that Rivera probably knew what Torres did scared him about what would happen if Rivera began running his mouth. For his part, Rivera denied that he was a messenger who had helped organize the murder. In fact, he said he was the one defending himself. Rivera stated that Santiago took the wannabe gangster under his wing and vowed to protect him. On the day of the murder, he said that Torres had threatened his life again and wanted to fight him. However, Santiago took the initiative by using the ruse to talk to Torres, but instead started fighting him. Rivera then jumped in to help finish off Torres. In Rivera's mind, he wanted the world to believe that if he had not helped kill Torres that day, then he would be the one who ended up dead. There were two sides to the story, and so with that, the jury went off to deliberate and decide on Rivera's fate. As the two sides eagerly awaited a verdict, they returned a question to the court. The jury asked if it was permissible to consider a lesser charge than first-degree murder. This was a good sign for both camps. For the prosecutors, it meant that they believed Rivera had committed a criminal act, and for the defense, it meant a lesser charge. However, before the trial started, Rivera, against the advice of his attorneys, stated he did not want any other charge other than first-degree murder considered. This was because of his advanced age. Already in his late 50s by now, even a conviction of second-degree murder would be a de facto life sentence for him. With just a few more years left on his armed robbery convictions, Rivera was hoping to be a free man soon to enjoy his retirement. Because of that, the judge ordered that the jury could only consider a first-degree murder charge and nothing else. Soon after that, the verdict came back. As the aged gangster rose to hear his fate, he had a slight smile on his face as he anticipated an acquittal. But that smile soon faded when he heard the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. It had taken years, but they finally got their man when the jury delivered a guilty verdict. And for a bit of poetic justice, the verdict came almost exactly 10 years to the day after the murder had taken place. When the jury members were questioned later as to how they reached their decision, they said that if the case were really about self-defense, why would Rivera and Santiago keep kicking and stomping Torres even after he was down? After the first few minutes, their point would have been made to back off. Everything afterward was unnecessary. Several months after Rivera's conviction, he learned of his fate. For the crime of first-degree murder, he would spend the rest of his natural life in prison. Of course, Rivera maintained his innocence at the time and continues to maintain his innocence to this day, claiming it was a self-defense case. But what about his co-defendant? In order to avoid the death penalty, Santiago skipped the trial and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in December 2016. He was soon also given an additional life sentence without parole. But despite the convictions, there were no winners here. Even though Torres was himself a monster, he was still a father with children and other family members who loved him. For him to meet such a violent end served no justice to either his own family or the family of his victims, since he had not been sentenced to death for his crimes. As for the police, despite obtaining convictions for the two killers, the FBI became no closer to taking down higher-ranking members of the Mexican Mafia for this murder. Due to the intense secrecy surrounding the group, even nearly 10 years of investigating yield no fruitful returns other than keeping two lower-level criminals behind bars for good. Unfortunately, it'll take much more police work, more crimes, and a good bit of luck to truly dismantle the Mexican Mafia for good in the future.
Friday night, a remote country road outside the city of Texarkana. I don't want to kill you, fellow. so do what I say," said the man brandishing a gun. He wore a white pillowcase with eye slits cut into it. 24-year-old Jimmy Hollis stared at the man in disbelief. His date, 19-year-old Mary Jean LeRae, clutched Jimmy's arm in terror. The man pointed the gun, ready to fire. Jimmy and Mary Jean followed orders and got out of the car. The city of Texarkana is half in Texas and half in Arkansas. In the 1940s, the city was an odd mix of rural and urban, quiet and bustling. The general mood of the city was peaceful, confident. World War II was over and America was getting back to normal. No one was prepared for the events that occurred during the spring of 1946. The evening began with a double date: Jimmy and Mary Jean and Jimmy's brother Bob and his girlfriend. The four of them went to the Strand Theater in downtown Texarkana to see a monster movie, The House of Dracula. After the movie, the couples went their separate ways. Jimmy drove his father's Plymouth to Richmond Road, a remote country road about a mile outside the city. The area was popular with locals as a lover's lane. Jimmy and Mary Jean were canoodling when a bright flashlight suddenly shone on them. A creepy stranger in a pillowcase mask armed with a gun demanded that they get out of the car. After a few seconds, they realized this wasn't a prank, so they obeyed him. The masked man then snarled at Jimmy to take off his breeches. At first, Jimmy refused, but Mary Jean urged him to comply. Jimmy removed his slacks and stood awkwardly in his boxers. The gunman suddenly slammed his pistol twice into Jimmy's head. A loud cracking sound rang through the air. Mary Jean thought Jimmy had been shot. Later, she would learn that the sound was his skull cracking. The gunman ended up letting Mary Jean go, but then chased her down the street and hit her with the flashlight. When finally he went back toward Jimmy, Mary Jean bolted. She ran about half a mile until she reached a house. She hammered on the door, screaming for help. Thankfully, the residents woke up and called for help. First to arrive at the crime scene was Bowie County Sheriff W.H. Presley and 3 Texarkana patrolmen. The gunman was long gone. Both victims were transported to Texarkana Hospital. Jimmy was in critical condition. He ended up being diagnosed with multiple skull fractures. He would spend the next 3 months receiving treatment for his injuries. Mary Jean was released the next day after receiving stitches for a scalp wound. However, she was deeply traumatized, suffered nightmares, and would ultimately leave the state to live with relatives in Oklahoma. Both Jimmy and Mary Jean were questioned by the police, and their stories were generally consistent except for one detail. Jimmy described their attacker as a 6-foot, tanned white male under 30, while Mary Jean claimed he was a light-skinned black man. The police had no motives and no suspects, although one published report claims that 6 people were arrested and released after questioning. This was the first crime, but it wouldn't be the last. March 24, 1946. A rainy Sunday morning, a remote country road outside the city of Texarkana. Around 8:30 a.m., a motorist passed a 1941 Oldsmobile sedan parked beside Rich Road and saw 2 figures inside who looked like they were asleep. Concerned, he stopped and got out to investigate. He quickly realized the 2 people weren't asleep. They were dead, slumped in pools of blood. He got back in his car and raced to town, where he alerted the city police. The police called Sheriff Presley since the car was parked on county turf, roughly a mile outside city limits. Sheriff Presley, along with Jackson Runnels, chief of police on the Texas side of Texarkana, were first on the scene. They found a man and a woman posed in the back of an Oldsmobile. The man knelt in front of the back seat, his forehead resting on crossed hands which lay on the back seat. The woman was sprawled face down on the back seat. Both victims were fully clothed. Both had been shot in the back of the head with a .32 caliber pistol. Despite the rain, there were huge bloodstains on the ground about 20 feet away from the car. The lack of a gun at the scene ruled out murder-suicide. The blood-stained dirt suggested that the couple had been slain outside, then returned to the car. The victims were soon identified as 29-year-old Richard Griffin and his girlfriend, 17-year-old Polly Ann Moore. Texarkana's 2 mayors pressed for the crime to be solved quickly. Sheriff Presley and Police Chief Runnels immediately launched a full-scale investigation, collaborating with Arkansas Side Police Chief Richard Giles, the Miller County Sheriff, the Arkansas State Police, and the Texas Department of Public Safety. A Texas Ranger also came to assist in the investigation. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot to go on. Rain and then morbid locals who came to view the crime scene obliterated any potential evidence. By the end of March, the authorities had questioned some 50 witnesses. The couple had been seen dining at a cafe around 10 p.m. with Griffin's sister Eleanor and her boyfriend the night before, but the authorities couldn't account for their time after that. Though the police didn't notice a connection between the Hollis-LeRae attack on February 22nd and the Griffin-Moore murder on March 24th, some uneasy locals did. However, hysteria had not gripped the city yet. April 14, 1946, Palm Sunday, a remote country road northeast of Texarkana in Nevada County, Arkansas. At 6 a.m., the Weaver family was driving on North Park Road when they spotted a man's body lying on the north shoulder. They quickly drove to the nearest house to call for help. The victim was soon identified as 17-year-old Jimmy Martin of Kilgore, Texas, a town about 105 miles away from Texarkana.
Texarkana. Jimmy had been shot 4 times. Investigators soon discovered that Jimmy had been in town visiting friends. The night before, he had a date with 15-year-old Betty Jo Booker. He arranged to pick her up after a dance at the local Veterans of Foreign Wars, or VFW Hall. Betty Jo played saxophone at the dance with a local band, the Rhythmaires. Friends saw the couple leave together. Authorities confirmed that Betty Jo had never made it home. A search started with the local volunteers helping out. Around noon, 3 friends of Betty Jo found the missing girl's body behind a tree near crossroads about 1 3/4 miles from Jimmy's death scene. She'd been shot twice. Jimmy's missing Ford Club Coupe, which had the key in the ignition, was found near the entrance to Spring Lake Park, about 1 1/4 miles away from his body and 3 miles away from Betty Jo's body. Jimmy and Betty Jo had last been seen alive at 2 a.m. on Sunday as they left the VFW Hall. They planned to visit Spring Lake Park, another popular lover's lane. A resident living near Betty Jo's crime scene reported hearing a gunshot around 5:30 a.m. The police found .32 caliber shells and a couple of slugs around Jimmy's car. The FBI joined the investigation as well as more Texas Rangers. FBI ballistics tests would reveal that the shells had microscopic markings matching the weapons used to kill Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. Several fingerprints were collected from the car that didn't belong to Jimmy or Betty Jo. The fingerprints were compared to FBI and local files, but no matches were made. For the 3rd time, authorities had little to go on. A second double murder, and the fact that it occurred quickly after the first shocked the town. The death of Betty Jo, well known and well liked, horrified local teens. The nightlife of Texarkana slowed to a crawl. Families set early curfews for their teens and barricaded themselves in their homes. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolt locks, guns, and ammo. Reporters from newspapers around the world descended upon Texarkana. On April 16th, hoping to outsell the competition, the Texarkana Daily News named the city's serial gunman the Phantom Killer. The name caught on and everyone began using it. Since the start, there had been some power struggles between the different law enforcement agencies over information and the best way to proceed with the investigations. The second double murder further intensified pressure on the authorities. They conducted patrols and even had decoys park on lovers' lanes, hoping to catch the killer in the act. But the Phantom never showed. Some 300 persons were detained for questioning, ex-cons, drifters, those with reputations. However, no one could be linked to the crimes. Local groups pledged money to be used as rewards for tips, leading authorities to apprehend the killer. By April 20th, reward money totaling $4,280, or some $60,200 in today's money, had been promised. Tips poured in, but they led nowhere. May 3rd, 1946. Friday evening, the Starks farm about 10 miles northeast of Texarkana. After a hard day's work, 37-year-old Virgil Starks relaxed in his living room armchair with a heating pad tucked behind him to soothe his aching back. He listened to the radio as he read the Texarkana Gazette. His wife, 36-year-old Katie Starks, who had already dressed for bed in a nightgown, lay on the bed in an adjacent room. She suddenly heard a noise and yelled for Virgil to turn down the radio. Then she heard the sound of breaking glass. Thinking that Virgil had dropped something, Katie went to the living room. As she reached the doorway, she saw that Virgil was standing. Suddenly, he slumped back into his chair. Katie raced over to her husband and lifted his head. Blood spilled onto her fingers. Virgil had been shot twice through a window behind him by a gunman standing on the front porch of the Starks' farmhouse. Katie had not seen the shooter or heard gunfire. She ran into the kitchen to call for help. The Starks had an old hand-cranked telephone mounted on the kitchen wall. Katie lifted the receiver, cranked the handle twice, then staggered back as 2 bullets slammed into the left side of her face. Several of her teeth shattered and went skittering across the kitchen floor. Dazed, Katie dropped to her hands and knees. The gunman hammered on a kitchen window trying to get into the house. Katie pushed past her pain, got to her feet, and stumbled through the house to make it out the front door. From there, Katie, barefoot, wearing a blood-soaked nightgown, ran across Highway 67 to a nearby house of her sister and brother-in-law, but they weren't home. So Katie ran another 50 yards to the next house. A few neighbors transported the bleeding, semi-conscious Katie to Michael Meager Memorial Hospital, where she immediately went into surgery. 1 bullet had pierced Katie's cheek and exited behind her ear. Doctors found another bullet wedged under her tongue. Katie survived her injuries but hadn't seen the gunman and couldn't describe him to police. As soon as they received word of the crime, the police, sheriff, and Texas Rangers quickly descended on the Starks farmhouse to collect evidence, dust for prints, and take pictures. The gunman had clearly gotten in. His footprints were on the linoleum. Katie had left a trail of blood and teeth during her mad dash to escape. When Virgil was shot, his heating pad had shorted out and burst into flames, scorching his chair. It was still smoldering. However, Virgil's corpse wasn't burned because it had fallen to the floor. Disturbingly, investigators found a few bloody handprints, suggesting that the killer had deliberately dipped his hand in Virgil's blood and creepily decorated the wall. No robbery occurred. Cash and Katie's jewelry were left untouched. As law enforcement combed through the evidence, some came to the conclusion that the Starks slaying had been committed by a different criminal. The first 3 crimes had happened on the Texas side of town, while the Starks lived in Arkansas. A .22 instead of a .32 was used, and the killer had changed his MO. Some claimed it was a copycat killing. Also, there were rumors that Virgil had an affair with one of his relatives' wives, and the shooting was revenge. As can be imagined, the latest slaying whipped Texarkana into a frenzy. Rumors spread. Altercations, fights, and shootings rose in the area. Residents' tempers were hair-trigger. Police spent a lot of time investigating tips that led nowhere, as people made accusations against anyone they disliked or considered weird. Arkansas State Policeman Max Tackett realized that every time the killer phantom struck, a car had been stolen and then later abandoned. Weeks after the Starks attack, the Texarkana police located a car stolen the same night as the Martin Booker murders. On Friday, June 28th, policeman Tackett staked out the stolen car until someone came back to it. That person turned out to be 21-year-old Peggy Swinney. When arrested and questioned, Peggy revealed that she was a newlywed. Earlier in the day, she had married Ewell Swinney, who had a history of counterfeiting and car theft. Her husband was currently some 25 miles away in Atlanta, Texas, trying to sell another stolen car. The couple had a stormy, violent relationship and had gone on a cross-country spree of stealing cars and picking up hitchhikers. Within a few days, the police had tracked down Ewell and arrested him for car theft. While being arrested, Ewell made some curious and possibly incriminating statements that suggested he was a murderer. During another interview with Peggy, the police lied, saying that they were holding Ewell for murder. Peggy then confessed that her husband was the phantom killer and offered several details about the Martin Booker murders. Police were able to independently verify some of her details. However, Ewell's fingerprints didn't match the prints found at any of the scenes. Peggy's stories kept changing across several more interviews. Police believe she was withholding some facts due to fear of incriminating herself. Eventually, Peggy recanted her original confession. Because she was an unreliable witness and they only had circumstantial evidence, the police couldn't arrest Ewell for murder. Also, by law in 1946, Peggy could not be forced to testify against her husband. But the police could and did charge Ewell with violation of his 1945 parole. Also, he was charged with a 3rd felony for his recent car theft. Ewell was found guilty and on April 18, 1947 sent back to jail for life as a habitual offender. Meanwhile, for most of the summer of 1946, the city of Texarkana remained on high alert and the authorities continued to investigate. Old police files include a list of 1,047 persons of interest that were investigated in the months after the Starks attack. Eventually, as there were no further attacks, outside law enforcement as well as the media slowly withdrew. The public relaxed their vigilance. The phantom killer never struck again. Over the next couple of years, a few people involved with the cases would be sent anonymous letters claiming that the wrong man was fingered and the real murderer was still out there. The letters dropped hints, but it's not known if police ever followed up on the leads. After the Supreme Court made judgments in the 1960s which altered the legal rights of criminal defendants, Ewell and thousands of other conflicts disputed their prior convictions. Ewell challenged the courts, saying that his sentence should have been no longer than 10 years and he shouldn't have received the habitual offender charge. Ultimately, after serving 26 years, in 1973, a judge granted Ewell writ of habeas corpus and ordered his release. Sadly, Ewell went back to his criminal ways and was in and out of jail for the next 20 years. He only stopped committing crimes after suffering a stroke. In 1993, a writer researching a book about the phantom killer tracked down Ewell Swinney at a Dallas nursing home. Ewell bragged about some of his crimes but angrily denied being the phantom or having anything to do with the murders. He died the next year at age 77. The phantom killer murders are still considered unsolved. There's nothing like checking into a hotel. You can kick back, relax, and let others take care of everything. Just don't go nuts at the minibar. Those little bags of pretzels add up. But when you check into a hotel, above all, you're trusting the hotel to provide safety and security. Your room is your sanctuary. This made it all the stranger when a man was murdered in the safety of his hotel room in the middle of one of America's oldest and most prestigious hotels. The year was 1935 in Kansas City, Missouri, and the hotel president was one of the crown jewels of the city's Power and Lights district. Less than 10 years earlier, it had even hosted the Republican National Convention, nominating Herbert Hoover for president. The hotel was best known for its Drum Room Lounge, which hosted legendary entertainers including Old Blue Eyes Frank Sinatra. Anyone who was anyone in Kansas City knew that the hotel president was the place to go people watching. Their most infamous guest, however, was still to come. Roland T. Owen was an unassuming man walking into the hotel president and asking for an interior room on the upper floors on January 2nd. He claimed to be from Los Angeles, and those who saw him during his stay at the hotel mostly remembered him for a nasty scar he had on his temple and a deformed ear. That led many people to assume he was a professional boxer.
An odd, quiet man, he talked to the bellhop Randolph Probst on the way to his room 1046 and claimed to have just been staying at another hotel but wanted a cheaper one. But Probst noticed something odd. For a man who had been traveling, Roland T. Owen barely had any baggage, just a hairbrush, a comb, and toothpaste in his pocket, and no suitcases to be seen. Mr. Owen was a mysterious guest, but a bigger mystery was about to put the hotel president in the history books. Mr. Owen continued to puzzle the workers at the hotel as he stayed there for 2 days. Maid Mary Soptic was shocked when she entered the dark room and found Owen sitting there in the dark with the shades closed and only a dim lamp on. He told her to go ahead and clean, but something felt odd to her about the room. No one ever saw Owen turn the lights on in his room, and he always seemed nervous. He left and asked her to leave the room unlocked as if he was waiting for someone. Roland Owen stayed at the hotel for 2 days, and the first night was when things started to get really eerie. When Mary returned, she found Owen lying on his bed fully dressed, and he had left a note on the bedside addressed to someone named Dawn. It read, "Dawn, I'll be back in 15 minutes. Wait." But no one had ever seen anyone else enter the room. Whoever Dawn was, Owen seemed to communicate with him more than any of the guests or staff. Mary Soptic reported many strange things, like the fact that Owen's room was locked from the outside at one point, but the door could only be locked from the inside. When she entered, she heard the phone ring, and Owen said, "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. I just had breakfast." "No, I'm not hungry." Owen seemed to be planning on a long-term stay, asking Soptic about the president's residential rates, but his stay would be a lot shorter than anyone expected. When Soptic returned to furnish Owen's room at 4 p.m. on the second day, she heard 2 men talking inside. When she knocked, she heard a deep voice speaking, definitely not Owen's. She asked if they needed towels, and the mysterious man said they didn't, but she knew there were no towels in that room. Jean Owen, who was staying in the room next door, said she heard many people talking in room 1046, shouting and cursing, and as the night went on, the behavior around the hotel only got stranger. A woman believed to be a prostitute wandered the halls looking for her client. She expected him in Owen's room but came out empty. Outside, a city worker observed a man wearing only an undershirt, pants, and shoes run into the street looking distressed. He was ranting, saying he would kill someone and looked wounded. Whether he was related to the mysterious goings-on in room 1046, no one was able to answer, but he disappeared into a taxi and was never seen again. The next morning, everyone would be looking for answers. It was an ordinary day on January 4th when Della Ferguson came on shift as the switchboard operator at the hotel president. She made her planned wake-up call to room 1046 when she noticed that the phone had been taken off the hook. She contacted Rudolph Probst to check on the room, and he found the door locked with a Do Not Disturb sign on it. When he called out, a voice inside told him to enter, but the door was still locked and no one was letting him in. He yelled to hang up the phone and left. Another bellboy, Harold Pike, had a key and let himself in after the phone wasn't hung up. He found Owen alone in the dark, naked and unresponsive. There was no sign of anyone else, and Pike put the phone on the hook and left. It was only 2 hours before the phone was off the hook again, and when Probst entered the room, he found something very different in the isolated, locked room. Owen was on the floor, on his hands and knees, and his head was bloody. More disturbing, there was blood all over the walls and on the bed and in the bathroom. Probst ran downstairs to get help, but when he returned, the door was blocked. Owen had fallen in front of it, barring entry with his body. They talked to the wounded man, and he eventually forced his way up and let them in. Doctors were called to examine him, and what they found was terrifying and impossible to explain. Owen had been tied with cord around his neck, wrists, and ankles. His neck showed signs of strangulation, and he had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. He had a nasty skull fracture from blows to the head, with the damage being so serious that blood splatters could be found on the ceiling. When Dr. Harold Flanders, a local doctor, asked him what happened, Owen insisted that he had fallen in the bathtub. When he was asked who hurt him, he said nobody. His injuries were serious and he was rushed to the hospital, but the mysterious Roland T. Owen would not be giving away any more of his secrets. By the time they arrived at Kansas City General Hospital, he had slipped into a coma and died soon after. No one had seen anyone enter the room that morning. There was no sign of a struggle in the room. Owen had been alive, if drunk, when Probst had entered the room. How did he get brutally murdered in a locked hotel room? That's what the Kansas City Police Department wanted to find out. Jean Owen was briefly detained and interviewed, but when her boyfriend backed up her story, she was released. An autopsy of Owen revealed that he had been fatally stabbed and bludgeoned. But one of the oddest things was that he had apparently been wounded between 4 a.m. and 5 a.m. based on the dried blood. That meant Owen had already been dying when Pike entered his room and found him lying in bed. A thorough search of the room found a few articles belonging to Owen, but they also found no evidence of the knife used to kill him. That ruled out suicide. But other odd items were found in the room, including a bottle of diluted sulfuric acid and a clothing tag from New Jersey. The crime scene team looked for fingerprints and found a set belonging to a woman that didn't match anyone at the hotel. Was this mysterious visitor the one who spelled the end for Roland T. Owen? The murder was front-page news, and detectives soon believed that Roland T. Owen was not who he said he was. A phone call to Los Angeles for the next of kin came up empty, and fingerprints of the deceased were sent to the Justice Department to await a match. But the case seemed to be going cold, until the hotel president received a mysterious phone call. A woman phoned the front desk to ask what Owen looked like and claimed to know him from a town named Clinton only 50 miles away. Sightings from around the city came in, and the Muhlebach Hotel, which the deceased had left due to the high rates, reported that he had checked in under another name, Eugene K. Scott. The LAPD confirmed that this was also likely a fake name, and the mystery only deepened. Soon, people from all around came, claiming to know the mysterious Mr. Owen under all different names. Was he the cousin of a man who came to see the body? No, that cousin died 5 years earlier. Was he a pro wrestler named Cecil Werner from Little Rock, Arkansas? No, the wrestling promoter couldn't make the match. New murders in the city soon stole the spotlight, and the mysterious death of Roland T. Owen, whoever he was, slipped away from the headlines. The body was going to be laid to rest in a potter's field when the funeral home received a mysterious phone call saying they would pay for a grave and service at a nearby cemetery. The funeral director asked what they knew about the death, and the person said that the man had been involved in a sordid affair while engaged to another woman. He said cheaters usually get what's coming to them, and hung up. Was the mystery man of room 1046 killed in a lover's spat gone wrong? And who was he? The answers would be a long time coming. It was over a year later when the next break in the case would come. The images of the man were circulated around the country, but it wasn't until a friend of Ruby Ogletree in Birmingham, Alabama saw him in the paper that the truth came out. Ruby quickly identified the man as her son, Artemis Ogletree. Her boy had hitchhiked to California in 1934, and he hadn't been home since. But she knew the details around the case that proved she was telling the truth. She quickly identified the cause of the distinctive scar on his temple as an accident with cooking grease he had as a child. She even showed the investigators letters her boy had sent her. There was just one problem. Several of the letters had been postmarked after Artemis Ogletree was murdered in Kansas City. Not just that, but Artemis was a simple boy who didn't know how to use a typewriter and used plain language. Several of the letters were typewritten and used literary language. She also had received phone calls from people who claimed to know Artemis, including one with a wild story about being in Egypt with him and Artemis saving his life in a fight. The man gave Ruby his name and she gave it to the police, but it's never been released. Who had been writing letters to a dead man's mother for years? With a new heap of evidence, courtesy of Artemis's grieving mother, the police reopened the case and soon they had their top suspect. Joseph Martin was arrested in 1936 in New York after killing his roommate and trying to ship the body to Memphis. When they found his wallet full of fake identification, they also found some handwriting that matched the letters received by Ruby Ogletree after Artemis's death. But no charges were ever filed and the case went cold. Who killed Artemis Ogletree in that locked hotel room in the Hotel President? Was it Joseph Martin as a part of his long career of crime? Was it an organized crime killing, and who was Dawn? Was it not a name at all and instead a title of a mob boss Artemis Ogletree had crossed? Or was it a lover's spat gone horribly wrong as Artemis's broken engagement came back to end his life? Or was there something else lurking in room 1046 of the Hotel President? Something unnatural that Artemis Ogletree was terrified of, that could stab a man to death with no knife to be found from behind a locked door. The mystery is still unsolved, and investigators still puzzle over it today, but the Hotel President is still taking guests to this day. December 1999, police in Pakistan find a package and a 32-page diary that outlines the brutal murder of 100 children, aged 8 to 16. The writer of the diary explains in gruesome detail how he lured the kids into his trap, strangled them and chopped them into small pieces, and dissolved their body parts in acid. He even provided police photos of the victims prior to their demise. Cops were dealing with the worst serial killer ever in the country of Pakistan. A killer who enraged the public so much they literally wanted to rip him to pieces. Maybe his fate should mirror his crimes, people said, with Hammurabi's code in mind. A life for a life, an eye for an eye, a nose for a nose, an ear for an ear, a tooth for a tooth, an equal wound for a wound. Welcome to one of the darkest stories in the annals of human history. The extent of these atrocities would come to light when the killer, 40-year-old Javel Iqbal, sent a letter to the newspaper in Lahore that read like this: All the details of the murders are contained in the diary and the 32-page notebook that had been placed in the room and had also been sent to the authorities. This is my confessional statement. When the cops got to his 3-room apartment, what awaited them was a scene of utter horror. The walls were covered in blood, children's clothes were strewn across the floor, dozens of pairs of little shoes and sandals were scattered around. In one room there was a vat of acid still bubbling, with what looked like the remains of legs bobbing up and down. A cop looked at the floor and picked up a note that was lying there. It read, "The bodies in the house have deliberately not been disposed of, so that authorities will find them." There were the remains of 3 children in that house. On a blood-spattered wall, there was a large piece of paper. Scrawled on it were the words, "Yesterday I killed my employee, Sajid, and incinerated his body in the container so that he could be punished for theft and for disturbing me again and again." What in God's name were they dealing with? The cops thought as they searched through the mess. For some reason, the killer had kept snakes. Police found the boxes they would have been contained in. In another room, they found a bunch of board games that children might enjoy. One of the cops picked up a video cassette from the floor, a popular Italian exploitation film entitled The Beast in Heat. On another wall was another note that read, "The world will remember this mode of revenge. The bodies flowed through the sewer just like my blood." The lengthy diary described how he killed the kids. There were even sometimes details as to where they likely lived and who their parents were. The diary explained how he got hold of them and the terrible things he did to them. It even detailed how much acid it took to dissolve a body, which according to the killer was exactly 120 rupees, just over a couple of dollars back then. Very soon after, the cops launched one of the biggest manhunts that Pakistan had ever seen. But who was this man, this monster? He was the 6th child of a fairly well-off businessman named Muhammad Ali Mughal. He went to school and college and had pretty much everything he needed. His pop set him up in the steel recasting business and let him stay at one of his houses. To all appearances, he was a young professional man who was doing just fine in life, but obviously that wasn't the case at all. As you'll see, behind that normal life there were some very dark secrets. He hadn't acted alone in the murders. Prior to his arrest, 4 teenagers were arrested on charges of helping him. One of them soon died in police custody. The cops said he jumped out of a window, but reports stated it was most likely they'd beaten him to death. In fact, the murder was so obvious the administration of the Lahore cops was moved around. Still, the hundreds of relatives of the missing kids who'd seen photos of their loved ones weren't exactly upset over the slaying of one of Iqbal's helpers. But where was he? Well, like a scene from the movie Seven, on December 30th, he walked right into the offices of the Urdu daily newspaper. He didn't exactly hold bloody arms up in front of him and say, "You're looking for me," but he did say this, "I am Javed Iqbal, killer of 100 children. I hate this world, I am not ashamed of my actions, and I am ready to die. I have no regrets." Things got very strange after that. He said the reason he hadn't gone to the cops and had chosen the newspaper was that he feared the police would kill him and try to make his murder look like something else. As you already know, and as you'll soon see, he was certainly not being overly paranoid for harboring that belief. He then changed his story, telling the judge in court that he hadn't actually killed the kids but had seen them being murdered by someone else. He told them that the reason he'd written the letters, the posters, and sent to packages was because he wanted to bring attention to the fact that parents had neglected those kids and had left them to their own devices in the streets. Sure, there'd been previous confessions, his lawyer said, but some of them had been made during a 3-week ordeal at the hands of very, persuasive cops. Still, this is the guy that had detailed the killings. It's the guy that had children's clothes and shoes in his house. Could he really not be the killer? 105 witnesses were introduced to the court by the prosecution. Even though the defense had claimed that many of the kids weren't actually dead and had gone back home, the testimony of witnesses didn't seem to suggest that. In fact, every day during the 2-month trial, parents of victims and angry citizens waited outside the courthouse, screaming that this guy had to be put to death. All over the world, people watched news clips of parents weeping as they rummaged through the pile of children's clothes police laid out. It also turned out that Iqbal had been arrested in the past for a crime involving a boy. The prosecutor said, "Okay, so we don't know where the bodies are, but there's enough evidence to put this man to death." But there was another story too. If 100 kids had been killed, how could that happen and no one report something when each disappearance occurred? Some people blamed poverty and the fact that some of those kids were lost and abandoned, often left alone to beg. Others talked about a taboo issue hardly ever broached in Pakistan, the issue of poor kids being prey to vulturous men. The whole macabre case underlines the terrible sexual frustration and perversion that lie just below the surface of our hypocritical society, said one Pakistani journalist. He said such abuse was rampant, but the crimes were not spoken about. In court, before the judge, Iqbal said, "Whatever I wanted to say has been distorted. I have seen the children being killed. I am an eyewitness to that. I was considered an insane person, but I beg that my point of view must also be heard. I consider myself as a culprit because I have been made a culprit by police." He said the cops in the past had extorted cash from him and his family. He also said that he was beaten by his servants and he'd gone to the cops to complain. Instead of helping them, they also beat him and then set him up on a false charge. He said after that he made a pledge of revenge. This is what he said to reporters when he turned up at their office to hand himself in. "I could have killed 500. This was not a problem. Money was not a problem. The pledge I had taken was of 100 children and I never wanted to violate this." He later changed his story, saying after the beating by his servants, he and some others went looking for them. He said it was during those searches that he discovered many young boys living on the streets, abandoned by their parents. He told the court that he took photos of them to bring attention to this social problem. Stories came out that painted a picture of Iqbal's secret life. It was said that when he was in his 20s, his parents tried very hard to arrange a marriage for him, but he resisted their every attempt and ignored the photos of women they put in front of him. The reason was he wasn't interested in women, but the opposite sex, and preferably someone of a young age. He did actually tell his parents he was going to get married, but it turned out he wanted to do that because the woman was the older sister of one of the boys he was attracted to. That fake marriage lasted only 3 months. It was also revealed how he opened a video game arcade offering free stuff to boys. People testified that he enjoyed nothing more than just sit around and watch them play. Sometimes he'd surreptitiously put a 100 rupee note on the floor. After a boy had picked it up and kept it, Iqbal would announce that everyone had to be searched in a private room. It was said that some terrible things happened to some of those boys, after which they were always given the 100 rupee note as a gesture of goodwill. Some people that knew him understood his ways, saying he was an evil genius that was cunning when it came to getting what he wanted. Parents actually stopped their kids from going to that arcade after hearing what the wealthy young man was up to. But then he opened a gym and also an aquarium as another way to get close to his prey. The court heard these stories and they'd seen the evidence that was available. He had his sob story and it was appearing that he had a passionate lawyer that believed his stories. One of the problems was the Pakistani police were corrupt and sometimes murderous, so accusations leveled against them by Iqbal weren't exactly unbelievable. It was actually discovered during the trial that many of the parents hadn't reported their kids missing because they were afraid to speak to cops. That might sound strange to some of our viewers, but in many parts of the developing world, people would rather not report something, even a car accident, because the victims can end up paying corrupt cops or face false charges. In fact, it came out that young children went missing all the time in parts of the country, and no one breathed a word about it to authorities. One mother whose kid was a victim said to Time magazine in the US, "It never even occurred to me to go to the police for help." A Pakistani intellectual and newspaper columnist named Irfan Hussain explained why. "The vast majority who are forced to come in contact with our cops, 9 times out of 10, they're shaken down even when reporting a crime. This case, as big as it was turning into something bigger, which was a powerful expose of societal wrongs." That same columnist said Iqbal could have easily killed 500 poor kids, and he absolutely would have gotten away with it. He had money, and his victims didn't. The cops, he alluded, were more interested in money than justice. When Judgment Day came, the country was on the edge of one giant seat. Mobs crowded the courthouse, small riots broke out in streets. The judge had the weight of a country on his shoulders. The police scurried around in dark places like rats in the gutters, hoping no more light would shine on their misdeeds. The judge, Allah Bakhsh Ranja, shocked everyone. He didn't only hand down the death sentence, but he ordered something that wasn't actually written into the law. He said the death sentence should be carried out in public at Pakistan's National Monument in Lahore. This is exactly what he told Iqbal that day in court. "You will be strangled to death in front of the parents whose children you killed. Your body will then be cut into 100 pieces and put in acid, the same way you killed the children. The 100 pieces were for the 100 victims. It was a case of eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, what's sometimes called the law of retaliation. Even for some hardliners, the punishment was a bit too much for the late 20th century. Iqbal's lawyer thought so, telling the British press, "There's no law which allows a person to be hanged publicly to cut up pieces of the body. It is against the Constitution of Pakistan." So, did it happen just as the judge had ordered? Well, we would say what we're about to tell you is shocking, but after hearing what you've heard already, you probably expect it. One day while Iqbal was in jail, he was found dead in his cell. The same day, one of his accomplices was also found dead in his cell. This happened just 4 days after Pakistan's highest Islamic court had agreed to listen to Iqbal's appeal against the death sentence. How could this happen in one of the most high-profile criminal cases in the history of Pakistan? Surely someone should have been keeping close eyes on those guys. There weren't any CCTV cameras working that night. As for the guard, who should have heard or seen something, he'd fallen asleep on the job, a seemingly not uncommon occurrence when high-profile people die in jail cells. You know how the authorities explained those deaths, and you'd be right in thinking some of the public didn't buy into it even as much as people detested those men. Not only was Iqbal found with a bloody nose and cuts to his face, but an autopsy revealed he'd been severely beaten over a period of days. It was also revealed he'd recently written to his lawyer, stating that he believed he was going to be murdered in his cell by prison authorities. You could call it rough justice, but the real injustice was the lives of some of the poorest, most vulnerable families in Pakistan remained blighted by the abuses and corruption. To his friends, Jason Dalton was always a friendly fella. Everyone said he'd never hurt a fly. He had no history of violence. He had no recorded mental issues. He was a married man with 2 kids who loved him dearly. And then one day, something snapped. A madman was on the loose, controlled no less by the devil himself. As crazy as it sounds, it's what Dalton said after he'd shot and killed people he'd never seen before in his life. In just about all cases involving serial or rampage killers, there are early signs that they'll lose the plot at some point. Nonetheless, on the outside, it didn't seem that Dalton had the markings of a maniac. In fact, his life looked like the picture of perfect middle America. Born on June 22, 1970, he grew up in a small rural community called Greenfield, not too far from Indianapolis. By all accounts, he had a regular childhood, replete with happy family gatherings and good relationships with his peers. He was never beaten at home, and he wasn't bullied in school. He was a good student and even better at sports, competing on the school track team and the wrestling and football teams. In short, Dalton didn't seem to have any kind of childhood trauma that could explain his incredibly grievous actions later in life. After getting married, his wife worked in sales and pulled in about $40,000 a year, and he earned around $50,000 a year working in insurance, so combined, they weren't exactly short of cash. Although Dalton would later work as an Uber driver to earn some extra money. Importantly though, he had 2 big obsessions. Those were rather masculine cars and something that might go with such cars, guns. He loved his guns. Like any old good red-blooded American, this short, stocky man, still muscular from his wrestling days in school, spent much of his free time shooting his guns and working on his various car projects. His friend said his marriage seemed to be made in heaven. He was also extremely devoted to his 2 kids. And this was exactly how things were in 2016 when Dalton walked into a local gun shop and purchased a 9mm semi-automatic handgun. The owner knew him and said the day he seemed in his usual good spirits. And then the devil got a hold of Jason Dalton. February 20th, 2016, a man named Matt Mellon ordered an Uber. The night before, he'd left his car at a buddy's house, so he wanted to go and pick it up. At precisely 4:21 p.m., the Uber arrived, with Dalton as the driver in a silver Chevrolet Equinox. Mellon sat in the front because Dalton's pet German Shepherd dog had taken the back seat. On the drive, Dalton got a call through his speaker, and Mellon listened in. He happily spoke to his child about dinner plans. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then something happened. Exactly what, we can't say, but it might have had something to do with a certain notice on his phone. Mellon later explained that's when he pretty much slammed the gas pedal. Then boom, we were off. It was pedal to the metal, probably 75 to 80 miles an hour down this road. I was bracing for impact, basically. Mellon screamed as Dalton swerved into oncoming traffic. He drove right through a median strip, through a stop sign, and then hit a Ford on the side. At this point, Mellon's heart was racing. He screamed at Dalton, "Please stop, you just hit someone." But his driver, not even looking to his side, seemed like a man possessed. Maybe he was. Finally, the maniac stopped. Mellon got out and without hesitation called 911. He looked up and saw the back of Dalton's head as the car raced away. Mellon could have had no idea how close he was to being shot. A little later, Dalton called his wife and asked her for the keys to his Hummer H3. She told him she'd taken him to his parents' place and would give him to him there. But before Dalton could get there, he received another notice on his Uber app, this time from someone wanting a ride from an apartment complex in Richland Township. He put his foot down as soon as he saw the message. We can have no idea what he was thinking at this point, but it seems he had murder in his mind. When he arrived at the complex, he stopped the car, opened the window, and talked to the woman named Tiana Carruthers. She later said, "February 20th is the day my whole life changed." She was with her young kids when Dalton screamed to a halt. He asked her if she was Macy, the person who'd made the call. She told him she wasn't. At first he drove off, but then for some reason he began to turn the car around. Slowly he drove back to Carruthers, his mean face staring right at her. As he got closer, he pointed his gun and shot her 4 times. She was in shock, barely feeling the bullets. As she fell to the ground, one of them dangerously lodged itself in her liver. Her quick thinking and decision to play dead probably saved her life. Thankfully, her children were unharmed. The person who made the Uber request then sent Dalton a message saying she'd made a mistake and the address had changed. At this point, he was driving like a lunatic and would likely have had a head-on collision had the driver of the other car not swerved out of the way. Dalton then hit another car after going through a red light. When he finally stopped, he messaged the person back, simply saying something had come up, explaining he couldn't make the pickup. After more hectic driving, he returned home. He told his wife he'd been hit and someone had shot at him.
He looked at her like he'd never looked at her before and then told her to arm herself. He said it wasn't safe outdoors. He said she should keep the gun on her and not let the kids out of the house. You'll see it on the news, he told her, without explaining what had happened. She was suspicious because he couldn't look her in the eye. He then told her to take the dog. He had to go out. Was the devil calling to him again? After his Hummer failed to start, he took the Chevrolet HHR, the car usually reserved for his wife. At 6:44 p.m., he got some money from an ATM. He then drove around for a while and returned home, this time to switch guns from a Glock to a Walther P99. For the next hour, he responded to his Uber requests and took people to their destinations. The passengers later said he drove at his normal speed, was friendly, and didn't look at all worried or panicked. Why he left those people alone is something of importance that we'll come back to later. The last pickup that went without incident was at 9:21 p.m. He took 3 people from the Fairfield Inn near a Cracker Barrel restaurant, which we'll soon return to the Kalamazoo Beer Exchange. All 3 passengers said their driver looked and drove fine. At this point, a loving husband and father named Richard Smith had arrived with a son at the Ford Kia dealership. The son Tyler wanted to show his pop a truck he had his eyes on. Sadly, this was to be their last day out together because Dalton had arrived at the showroom, and he believed he was still on a mission from Satan. Dalton walked up to the 2 and asked them what cars they were interested in. He then just shot them down in a hail of bullets. Between them, the 2 Smiths were shot 18 times. In utter shock, Tyler's girlfriend, Alexis Cornish, ducked for cover while still in the car outside. Once Dalton was gone, she used her boyfriend's phone to call 911. The father and son died from their injuries at the scene. The Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety received a call saying shots fired at the Kia showroom. Police then raced to the scene just as investigators were taping off the previous crime scene at the apartment complex. When they arrived, they found Alexis hiding in the car and the 2 males already deceased. Alexis told police the culprit was a large white male with gray hair. As the officers were trying to figure out what had gone down, they got another call over the radio. Again, it said shots fired. 10 minutes had now passed since the Kia showroom shooting. It was 10:17 p.m. when Dalton walked up to a white van in the parking lot of that Cracker Barrel restaurant he'd been close to earlier. Sitting in the van was an elderly woman. Allegedly prompted by the devil, Dalton asked her something and then shot her. He turned to the car close by, occupied by 4 people. He shot 17 rounds into that vehicle. Approximately 6 minutes later, when Dalton was on the road again, a Michigan State Police trooper arrived at the parking lot to find the woman in the van already dead. 3 of the 4 people in the other car were also dead. One of them was Mary Lou, who died next to her sister-in-law Mary Jo, who also died. 2 of their friends, Dorothy Brown and Barbara Hawthorne, succumbed to their injuries too. All of them were in their 60s and 70s. Hawthorne was with a 14-year-old girl named Abigail Kopf. She was shot in the head but miraculously survived after numerous surgeries. Now, multiple police units were on the lookout for a man driving a Chevrolet HHR who they were pretty sure was behind all of the shootings. They were told over the radio that they were looking for an average-build male, tall, dark clothing, possibly blonde hair. The undersheriff told the reporter, "We've had several shootings here tonight in the county and city of Kalamazoo. They all appear to be related. We have multiple people dead. In summary, what it looks like we have is somebody just driving around, finding people and shooting them dead in their tracks." Meanwhile, Dalton was still using his app. At 12:04 a.m., he picked up 3 passengers and took them to a Western Michigan University dormitory. They later said the driver seemed completely normal to them, if not a bit unfriendly. As you'll see, it was good luck on their part that they weren't killed. 8 minutes later, he took 4 young passengers from Bell's Eccentric Cafe to the Radisson Hotel. One of them joked, "You're not the shooter, are you?" Dalton said no. Just under a few minutes later, during the next trip from Central City Tap House to Rutgers Up and Under, one of the 3 passengers again joked and asked him if he was the killer. Dalton replied, "Wow, that's crazy. No way, I'm not the guy." When he pulled up at Rutgers Up and Under, a police officer spotted the car and called for backup. At 12:40 a.m. it arrived, and in no time at all, Dalton was in handcuffs after putting up no fight at all. There was a reason for this. They found a gun and a ballistic vest in the car, and later, after watching surveillance tapes, they knew they had their man. While the analysis was being performed on Dalton's phone and at each crime scene, he sat with investigators in an interrogation room. What had happened to this seemingly normal family man? It seemed he had no motive for the crimes whatsoever. At first he didn't want to talk, but after a while he started chatting about his beloved German Shepherd. He also asked to speak to his wife, but soon hung up. He told the officers he just wanted to hear her voice. For a long time, the investigators were getting nowhere, but then Dalton surprised them all. He told them he'd been driving his Uber, and when he heard a beep on his phone, he looked at the app and saw the Eastern Star. He then explained, "I just tapped it, and there was like a devil head that popped up. It was some sort of like horned head, like a cow head or something. I pressed the button, and that's where all the problems went after that." He explained that when he tapped the devil's head, it told him he could drive as crazy as he wanted, and no harm would come to him at all. He could do what he wanted and say what he wanted and there would be no repercussions. He then said that the Devil app had two modes, a red mode and a black mode. When it's in that black mode, he explained, it literally has control of you. It would do a little blink at me. It was then and there that he had to do exactly what the Devil told him to do. He said if it dinged once, he had to complete an assignment, but if it dinged twice, then he didn't have to do anything. So he explained to the shocked cops that the reason he shot some people and didn't shoot others. He told them that the only reason he didn't start shooting when he was finally pulled over was the Devil app was in red mode. Dalton further explained, I was no longer being guided. I mean, that's not my nature to be that way. The minute that app went from black to red, I had my presence. The officers, of course, had to try to understand whether Dalton really believed this or if he was just trying to act crazy. One of them said he really did look like he believed in what he was saying. It was like he was a puppet, he said. Dalton didn't show much remorse for what he'd done, although he did express some concern over shooting the young girl. Still, he seemed to be quite relaxed for a man who'd ruined numerous lives and was now looking at a long prison sentence. When police looked into his life, they found what we explained at the start. Dalton was a well-liked family man who was respected in his community. A couple of people talked about how he would fire his guns all the time and that he could go at times from placid to agitated, but other than that, there seemed to be no explanation for why he'd gone on his rampage. He just kept telling the detective the same thing again and again, such as this. The minute I logged on, to be honest with you, I don't know what happened. I know you guys are going to have a hard time believing this, but it literally took over my mind and body. It was then up to the courts to decide if he was crazy or not. Despite his talk of the Devil, psychiatrists found him fit to stand trial. Still, police were stumped as to what had gone wrong, and they still are now. Dalton might have been a bit wary about burglars, but other than that, he didn't seem to have any pathological fears. He held no extreme views at all. He was a good father and husband who had just metamorphosed one evening into a brutally cruel killer. Even while awaiting trial, he seemed happy enough looking at his cell walls all day. One detective said, he's very even-tempered. He's not upset about anything. He doesn't display any noticeable emotions. What the detective said sounded a bit like what had happened in the Michael Douglas movie Falling Down, in which Douglas lost his mind from the vicissitudes of daily life and went on a mad rampage. The detective admitted, we're probably weeks away from finding out, but in the end the final analysis might be, this was a guy who just cracked up. But there were signs later that Dalton was a very unstable man. At one point during the trial, one of the survivors, Tiana Carruthers, was giving her testimony. She could barely talk through her tears, and that's when Dalton showed some of his more unhinged side. Seemingly without any concern for his victim, he started rambling about black bags. He then shouted at her, take it, and though restrained, he tried to get up from his chair. She screamed hysterically, and that's when he was manhandled out of the courtroom. It's difficult to understand what he was trying to do, but let's just say the quiet family man at that moment looked like someone capable of killing, and perhaps even believing Satan talked to him through his Uber app. On February 5, 2019, after pleading guilty to all charges, Jason Dalton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thanks to the popularity of TV crime dramas, we might have some unrealistic expectations about what it takes to solve a murder. We expect a handsome and brilliant investigator to find all of the elusive pieces of evidence at the scene, catch that obscure clue that's revealed during the autopsy, put all those details together to come up with the suspect, hunt down and capture the killer, and bring them swiftly to justice, all within a neat 60-minute episode. Dubbed the CSI effect, experts worry that the general public and even juries don't understand the realities of solving a crime. So what really goes on during the crime autopsy? How does a real-life CSI solve murders? TV dramas like CSI tend to make solving a murder look like a piece of cake, and most of what the general public knows about crime autopsies comes from those sensational whodunit shows and high-profile celebrity deaths. But in reality, there's actually a ton of work and expertise that goes into determining how someone died and if foul play was involved. And that work starts long before the body finds its way to the morgue for an autopsy. The autopsy is the internal and external examination of a body after death, when a trained pathologist uses a variety of surgical techniques, laboratory tests, and other strategies to determine the exact cause and circumstances of the death. Even though the College of American Pathologists recommends that an autopsy be completed for every death, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes the cause of death seems obvious, or the family declines to pay the $3,000 to $5,000 to have an autopsy performed. But when a death is suspicious or the police suspect foul play, an autopsy is an essential part of the investigation and can provide important legal evidence that can help solve the crime or determine who is responsible for the victim's death. On TV, the heroic detectives always seem to be the ones to find the key piece of evidence at the scene. But in reality, it's actually the same medical examiner who will later perform the autopsy that has the training and expertise to assess the scene, notice the important details, and determine what evidence should be collected.
The medical examiner is a leading member of the investigation team, and they actually help organize the scene and coordinate the investigation. They're instrumental in defining the perimeter of the crime scene, securing the evidence, and coordinating and tracking the activities of many other people involved in the investigation. It's their job to uncover if a crime was committed and to determine how the location and the position of the body could be linked to the cause of death. For example, if an elderly man with a history of heart conditions is found dead in the snowbank next to a shovel outside of his home, it's the medical examiner who will make the call that he likely suffered a heart attack while shoveling the snow. The medical examiner's job actually starts the moment they get the call informing them of a suspicious death, and there's a mountain of work involved before they even get to the autopsy. In fact, scene investigation is often more important than the autopsy itself, and a thorough investigation may reveal the cause of death before the body even gets to the morgue. For example, an autopsy on a healthy 30-year-old with no medical history and no toxicology findings may not be able to provide a firm cause of death. Only by attending the scene and noticing the body laying in a pool of water next to an electrical outlet with a screwdriver stuck in it can the medical examiner know for sure how the subject died. As soon as the medical examiner gets the call that the body has been found, their work starts, even before they get to the scene. They start to gather as much information about the body as possible. At the very least, they try to determine the approximate age and gender of the deceased and if there's any early evidence of foul play. If the deceased has already been identified and the family has been notified, the examiner will also start to gather a medical and personal history. Next, the examiner will get ready to head to the scene and will gather all the tools and equipment they need to complete their investigation. Among the many important items in their toolkit, they'll make sure they have an apron, gloves, hair and shoe covers, and a face shield to protect the scene from contamination, and to protect themselves. Depending on the location of the scene and the weather, they might bring along things like flashlights, rain gear, bug spray, and sunscreen to keep themselves as comfortable as possible during the often grueling and always meticulous process. They'll make sure to have a good supply of swabs, containers, and plastic bags to collect important pieces of evidence. Most importantly, they'll bring along tools to help them carefully document the scene: pen and paper, a tape recorder, and a camera. The medical examiner's first job is to determine if a crime was committed at the death scene. Every death scene is a potential crime scene until proven otherwise. The first and most important rule of crime scene investigation is to not disturb or contaminate the scene. The examiner must wear protective equipment and avoid sitting on any surfaces or leaning on any walls. After making sure the scene is safe and secure, the medical examiner will begin their systematic and thorough examination of the scene and attempt to answer some very important questions, like, did the death occur at this location? Can the death be attributed to natural causes? Is anything out of place at the scene? And are there any signs of violence or foul play? If foul play is suspected, the medical examiner will guide the investigations in further processing the scene, directing them to collect latent impressions, trace evidence, and anything else relevant to the investigation, like possible murder weapons or medications found nearby. This is yet another misconception about crime scene investigation that comes from watching too many crime dramas. Although the medical examiner plays a lead role in this stage of the investigation, their job is to observe a great deal, but to actually do very little. Their four major tasks are note-taking, videography, photography, and sketching. The rest of the hands-on work will be done by other investigators and crime scene technicians at the medical examiner's direction. The medical examiner will take great care to document every detail of the death scene, starting from the moment they're notified of the death. Their highly detailed notes will start with details about the date, time, and method of notification, and any details known about the deceased at the time. When they arrive on the scene, they'll document how they got there and when and what personnel are on the scene. Then they'll turn their attention to crafting a full scene description, noting everything from the layout of the scene to the furniture and structures nearby to even the weather. They'll also take note of any containers nearby that might hold other pieces of evidence like trash cans and ashtrays. They'll document and analyze any blood spillage or spatter, noting the shape and flow of patterns of the blood. The medical examiner will also have to be careful to keep track of any assignments they've made to other team members, such as doing a walkthrough of the scene or collecting evidence. Only once the scene has been thoroughly investigated and described does the medical examiner turn their attention to the body itself. They'll create a highly detailed victim description that outlines the physical conditions of the body at the death scene, noting important things like the body's position, any rigor mortis or death stiffness, and the level of decomposition. Generally, the more contorted the position of the body, the more sudden the death was. The victim may have literally fallen in their tracks. They will carefully photograph the body in the position it was found before carefully moving it into a face-up position and beginning a head-to-toe examination. Starting from the top and working their way down, The examiner will push aside clothing without removing it to carefully check every inch of the body for any visible wounds or bruising, the presence or absence of clothing, jewelry, or identification. The most important goals of this preliminary examination is to establish a working theory of the cause of death and to determine if the death occurred at the same location that the body was found. Once the death scene investigation is complete, the medical examiner is also responsible for preparing the body and overseeing the transportation of the corpse to the mortuary for the autopsy itself, while ensuring the least possible disturbance or loss of evidence. They'll place and secure bags over the deceased's hands, feet, and head, and place the body into a bag to retain any evidence like loose fibers as it's being transported to the morgue in a hearse. The autopsy itself usually takes only between 2 and 4 hours to perform, but it can take up to 6 weeks for the results to be ready. Yet another misconception from TV, where we've come to expect the entire investigation to be neatly wrapped up within the timeline of a 60-minute episode. Autopsies are best performed within 24 hours of death before the organs begin to deteriorate. But even autopsies performed on decomposed or exhumed bodies can still provide vital new information. The autopsy itself starts with yet another careful inspection of the body. Something else we don't see much of on TV are the many layers of duplication and redundancy that go into a real-life investigation. The medical examiner will carefully weigh and measure the body and document its characteristics like age, gender, and hair and eye color. Once the clothing has been removed, they'll examine the body yet again, this time looking for trace evidence, signs of injury like bruising, scratches, or wounds, and identifying marks like tattoos or scars. An X-ray may be done to look for any broken bones, skeletal abnormalities, or to locate bullets lodged in the body. The medical examiner will meticulously record all the findings on both a body diagram and in recorded verbal notes. Once the outside of the body has been thoroughly examined, it's time for the internal exam. The dissection starts with making a large Y-shaped incision on the torso from the shoulders to the mid-chest and all the way down to the pelvic region. Then a saw is used to cut through the cartilage and the rib cage to expose the internal organs. The organs are first examined and documented in place, and then removed one by one to be weighed and carefully inspected. Tissue samples may be taken along with blood and urine samples to be tested for drugs or infections. The stomach is also emptied so the contents can be examined and tested. Next, the examiner makes a precise incision around the back of the head from ear to ear and pulls the skin forward to expose the skull. A specially designed saw is used to open the cranium without damaging the soft brain tissue below. The skull cap is removed, and finally, gingerly, the medical examiner removes the brain for closer inspection and further testing. After carefully preserving and cataloging the various tissue and organ samples, the organs are carefully set back into place in the body after being sealed in bags to prevent leakage. The rest of the body cavity is stuffed with wool. The rib cage is set back in place, and the large incision is sewn back up using the characteristic baseball stitch so famous from the big screen. Finally, the body is carefully washed and prepared to be delivered to the funeral home. The professional who performs the autopsy undertakes their work with the utmost care and respect, so even a body that has undergone a thorough autopsy can still be presented in an open casket to allow friends and family to see their loved one last time. With the crime scene thoroughly investigated and the autopsy carefully performed, the medical examiner will use their mountains of documentation, their copious notes and voice recordings, their carefully drawn sketches, the countless crime scene photographs and video, the test results, and more to prepare their official report on the cause and manner of death. This report will be used by investigators to hopefully solve the crime and get justice for the victim. But unlike in the TV shows, this process can take months or even years, if it even gets solved at all. Thanks to the CSI effect, we seem to expect crime scene investigation to be like what we see on TV, but real life is not as flashy, as exciting, or nearly as fast. It is every bit as impressive though. The medical examiner plays a key role in the investigation from the very first moment that the body is found, right up until the body is sewn back together and prepared for the funeral home. The examiner oversees the investigation of the crime scene, completes the crime autopsy, and it's hard to imagine how real-life CSI could solve murders without them. 1974. 24-year-old Jack Unterweger stands in court and receives a life sentence for the brutal murder of an 18-year-old girl. 15 years later, he's celebrated by politicians and intellectuals for the stories, poems, and plays he's written behind prison walls. "We will never find a prisoner so well prepared for freedom," states the prison ward. Oh, he was wrong. So very, very wrong. Jack Unterweger, born Johann Unterweger, didn't just kill again. He went on a murder spree that took him across countries and continents, ending with a face-off with U.S. Marshals on Miami Beach. But let's go back to the start of this incredible, almost unbelievable story. Unterweger was born on August 16, 1950 in a beautiful part of the world, a small town in Austria called Judenburg. After Nazi Germany annexed Austria during the war, the town was home to a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp. The war ended, but it wasn't easily forgotten in that town. Judenberg was still dealing with the fallout from the war when Jack came to life. He was a product of a one-off encounter of the night. That was when his mother, Theresia, met an American soldier. This GI wasn't interested in fatherhood, and no sooner than he was told what had happened, he turned his back. Theresia, who worked as a prostitute, wasn't exactly up for taking care of a child either. She sent Jack to live with his violent, alcoholic grandfather when he was just 2. Sometime later, his mother was murdered, and Jack knew there was no escape from his horrible grandfather. Before he was 10, he was an avid imbiber of schnapps and still barely able to read or write. He soon started stealing and then moved on to pimping, spending much of his youth behind bars. The angry young man couldn't keep his hands to himself. As he got older, he took to assaulting women. The crescendo of that violence came in 1974 when he was 24. One night in West Germany, he lost the plot and strangled a girl with her own bra. She was 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer. He later said that when he pulled on the straps, he could see his mother's face in the dying girl. Over the years, he read, and he read voraciously, taking a particular liking to people you might call literary rascals, intellectual writers who'd chronicled the life of crime, such as Jean Genet. Unterweger read about the American prisoner Jack Abbott, who had written wonderfully about the life of crime from solitary confinement. Unterweger read about how Abbott's book, In the Belly of the Beast, was hailed by American literary critics. He wrote short stories, poems, and plays himself, culminating in 1983 with his autobiography Purgatory or the Trip to Prison, Report of a Guilty Man. Now, Europe had a celebrated intellectual behind bars, and like what happened over in the US, the European literati extolled the works of the downtrodden Unterweger. Artists and writers and even politicians went to visit him. They wrote pieces in the newspaper about how this man had reformed and become an asset to society. In his writing, Unterweger freely admitted he'd once been a beast, stating in one chapter, "I wielded my steel rod among the prostitutes and pimps of Hamburg, Munich, and Marseille. I had enemies and conquered them through my inner hatred." But now he'd changed. He was rehabilitated. Art had saved him. Austrian intellectuals often talked about how rare it is for a violent criminal, a killer no less, to have accessed the antipodes of his mind and discovered the root of his anger. Others joined in the chorus of celebration, signing petitions for the release of Unterweger. One of his vocal supporters was Elfriede Jelinek, a future winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature. He later said about the imprisoned Unterweger, "He was so tender. At that moment, we decided we had to get him pardoned. It was a travesty of justice to keep him locked up," people said. "It was like clipping a wounded bird's wings, like hiding from the world one of its wonders." One intellectual that signed the petitions later remarked about this metamorphosis from ugly killer to wondrous artist, "We want to believe him very badly." Then, in 1990, the prison warden said these words, "We will never find a prisoner so well prepared for freedom." An intellectual wrote that his release was a triumph of the individual over all the social and political pathologies into which he'd been born. The thing was, all those supporters only had to look at what happened to Jack Abbott. People had also gotten behind him after his book garnered praise from the public and media alike. People screamed for his release too, but some prison officials didn't think Abbott was ready for the outside world. One of them said, "I thought that Mr. Abbott was a dangerous individual. I didn't see a changed man. His attitude, his demeanor indicated psychosis." About 6 weeks after Abbott was released from prison, he went to eat in a Manhattan restaurant. He needed to pee but was told the bathroom was for employees only. The kind waiter showed him a place out back where he could urinate, whereupon Abbott stabbed him to death. This was 9 years prior to Unterweger being released, but oh God, did it serve as a warning. Unterweger wouldn't just kill again, he'd become an international serial killer. No sooner than he was out, he became a celebrity. His plays hit the streets, he gave readings from his book and other stories all over Austria and beyond. Wherever he went, artists and writers wanted to meet him. He even had a regular spot working as a reporter for Austria's national news service. The more TV shows he ended up on, the more money he got. He'd drive around town in a flashy Ford Mustang, only eating at the best restaurants. While he pulled up outside, everyone knew it was him. His license plate read W. Jack 1. Just a few months after his release, he was in Czechoslovakia to research the red light district in the capital, Prague. Maybe he was, but he was also planning to murder again. In fact, if you read his poetry, you might have guessed that. Here is one such poem infused with the stench of murder. "You still seem strange and distant, and lively, death. But one day you will be close and full of flames. Come, lover, I am there. Take me, I am yours." Maybe that's what he was thinking when he murdered a Czech prostitute named Blanka Bokova. She was found strangled by her own underwear.
That was the same MO as Unterweger's first murder. Still, police didn't even look into him. After all, he was now a star. He went back to Austria where he killed at least another 6 prostitutes, all of them garroted with their own bras and dumped, usually in the woods. He became a suspect at this point, but with no forensic evidence or other evidence tying him to the murders, police didn't go after him. That would be left up to the American cops, veritable experts on serial killing after seeing 2 decades of blood-spattered bedroom walls. Unterweger was still barely out of prison and he likely would have kept on killing in Europe, but then he was handed a key to make a dream come true. That was to visit the USA, the place where his father had come from. He'd been given an assignment from a magazine to write about crime in the US, which in 1991 was making headlines around the world. But he wasn't going to cover gang violence. Instead, he was going to talk about his favorite thing: red light districts. Unterweger chose Los Angeles as his place to put pen to paper and in the meantime secretly murder women. The LAPD was told about his arrival, and so on occasions he was given rides around the city by cops so he could get a first-hand view of the poorest parts where women plied what's called the world's oldest trade. When he wasn't out patrolling the streets, he was actually doing a bit of writing from his hotel room. That hotel was none other than the Cecil Hotel, a place not far from Skid Row, a place which has gained quite the reputation over the years. An American writer later said that Unterweger really immersed himself in the lifestyle around the mean streets of LA. But unfortunately, he also murdered 3 women while on that working vacation. All 3 were sex workers. The first victim was 35-year-old Shannon Exley, whose body was found beaten and strangled in the Boyle Heights neighborhood. The murder weapon was her bra. Just 10 days later, in the same neighborhood, 33-year-old Irene Rodriguez was found dead. Her injuries were not too different from the previous woman's. The third victim was 26-year-old Peggy Booth, discovered in Malibu Canyon. She'd been beaten and strangled with her own bra. This is part of an article Unterweger wrote while he was in LA. Real life in LA is dominated by a tough struggle for survival, by the broken dreams of thousands who come to the city, and an equal number who leave, sometimes dead. No kiddin', Jack. He returned home to Austria to finish his writing on the crime-infested USA where no man or woman is safe, and it is when he was there Interpol heard about the LA murders. The European cops talked at length to the LA cops, and it soon became very apparent that wherever Unterweger laid his hat, women were killed in a very similar way. It didn't take a Columbo to figure out the connection, and after some more investigating, Austrian police secured a warrant for his arrest. Problem was, he'd left the country. That could only mean one thing: more murders. Unterweger first headed to Switzerland with his girlfriend Bianca Mrak, and soon after they took off to Paris, and from there they headed to the US again, destination Miami, apparently because his girlfriend loved that TV show Miami Vice. He knew the cops were after him back home, and on occasions he contacted them. One newspaper ran the headline, "Hello, it's me, the mass murderer." Mrak got a job as a stripper and earned some extra cash from selling her story to the tabloids. That story was headlined, "Bianca's Exclusive Love Story, The Girl and the Murder Suspect." Unterweger did what he did best, after killing that is, and settled down with an old typewriter to tell some of his tales. His life as an Austrian Charles Bukowski didn't last long. The pleasures of the damned were stopped in their tracks when U.S. Marshals arrested Unterweger on Miami Beach after he went to collect some cash from the USA Money Exchange. Apparently, he cried all the way to the police station, but he didn't remain locked up in the US for long. He was extradited to Austria to face the music there. His deportation, by the way, was only down to his not having told US authorities about his felony conviction. Nonetheless, he was first asked about why he was in the US and told he was being investigated for murder. To that, he gave the statement, "I went to LA to write stories on prostitutes and homeless people. While I was in LA, I dated the receptionist at the Hotel Cecil, a girl named Carolina. I also dated 3 prostitutes, 1 white, the other 2 Latina. I killed no one in Los Angeles." He still had support back home though, much of it coming from those intellectuals that had supported him years before his release. Remember, from the time of his release to this point was only just over a year and a half. Some people said the authorities didn't want to believe in his transformation. Maybe they said he was being set up. One intellectual who still believed in him told the Guardian newspaper, "If he was the killer, he would be one of the cases of the century. Statistically, the chance that I would know one of the cases of the century is so unlikely that therefore I think he is not guilty." Unterweger was charged with 11 murders in total, 3 in the US, the rest in Europe. In court, he admitted that he was no angel, but he said he wasn't guilty of those murders. He said in one declaration, "I was a rat, a primitive criminal who grunted rather than talked, an invertebrate liar. The prosecutor is right. I consumed women rather than loved them, but I'm counting on my acquittal because I'm not the culprit. Your decision will affect not only me but the real murderer, because he's laughing up his sleeve." Police had managed to find one of the cars he had used in his travels in Europe, and in it, they found some human hairs. Unterweger's lawyers then told him if they can conduct the DNA test, then the devil's gonna catch you. Yet again, Unterweger claimed he was innocent. After hearing the evidence, the jury found him guilty and he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. For those of you that study the mind and what can go wrong, you won't be surprised to hear that a psychiatrist said Unterweger suffered from narcissistic personality disorder. Still, you have to ask some questions about the evidence. Those hairs that were genetically matched to one of the victims were found in a car that was then 11 years old and had had 4 different owners after Unterweger. It was this evidence, too, that cemented his guilty verdict. Much of the other evidence was circumstantial. Sure, people were murdered in the same way wherever Unterweger went, but could that have just been a really strange coincidence? He also didn't have an alibi for the murders, not one of them. But this is what Unterweger's lawyer said about that. It's always a coincidence if one has an alibi. Such an intelligent man would certainly have taken care to have one if he needed it. It's also worth noting that while he didn't have an alibi, not one person ever came forward and said they'd seen him with one of the victims. That's why 2 jurors wanted to acquit him, but the majority of them were against him, and the sentence was passed. That was the last anyone saw of Jack Unterweger. He was found dead in his cell on his first night in jail. Now, you need to watch how Tylenol became the perfect murder weapon, or have a look at the coder who became a criminal mastermind, Paul LaRue.